We're now going to go, we're now reopening for the day. Could Ms. Burns please take the roll?
Akwe-Badu?
Good morning. Present.
Bernal?
Present.
Erickson?
Present.
Horne?
Here.
Jones?
Here.
Phillips?
Oh, yeah.
And we have a quorum.
Well, for all the viewers out there.
Your microphone is off, I think.
Oh, it isn't on. For all the viewers out there, we're now going into closed session. We will return in approximately 45 minutes to an hour. We're going to go back into session. For those of you that were not here earlier this morning, was on and went off? Okay, sorry about that. For those of you that weren't here today, that we started the day with a closed session. We're now going back into open session. There are going to be a couple of agenda items taken out of order because we have a board member that needs to leave for due to a conflict. So what were those agenda items you'd like to have moved, Ms. Jones?
Can we move up item number 20 and number 21?
Certainly. We're going to move up agenda items 20 and 21. Excuse me. And then we're going to go to the topic, we're going to go to the legislative update. I know that there are people that here that want to address the question of continuing education and other forms of education and training for suicide assessment and intervention, but we need to take these two items first, and then we will go immediately thereafter to that language. We'll take that at the beginning of the legislative update. Okay, so item number 21 is me. That's me. 20, excuse me. Okay. So item number 20A is our calendar for the upcoming year. So that is indicative of all the upcoming committee meetings that we have, as well as the upcoming board meetings. Some of these details are not completely specific yet. Yeah, would you please?
Sure. Just to add to the meeting event calendar, staff has been discussing with Dr. Phillips the proposal to do legislative office visits as we did at the February meeting last year. We have a couple of legislative proposals. There have been a couple of other policy issues that have been brought up, such as reimbursement for telehealth. So what the plan or goal would be is on February 8th, on Wednesday, we would schedule visits with legislators in the afternoon. And then Thursday and Friday would be full board meetings. And the kind of strategy behind that was last year when we scheduled our meetings for the morning of Thursday, members may not have checked into the office until later, and then they had to check into legislative session at 9 a.m. and then members go home to their districts on Friday. So we want to make the most use of our time in February for our meetings. So I just wanted to give the members a heads up that that will be what staff is going to work on, and just to let you know for scheduling purposes that will be the goal, is to schedule them in the afternoon on Wednesday.
Thank you. So the next agenda item relates to committee meetings, or the next part of my report. And to that end, I'm going to actually ask Ms. Jones she has to have this added to the agenda, and maybe she can explain why.
Sure. Good morning, board members. I wanted to just bring up this conversation as one of our. It's on. Can you hear me? One of our outgoing board members had shared just a comment and asked us to consider, is it effective having board meetings separate from our committee meetings? As some of you all might remember, I know when I first joined the board, during the 2-day board meeting, we actually had committee meetings throughout the meeting. And the conversation was like, well, I think we thought at the time we switched to do them separately because we could be maybe a little bit more effective in between board meeting times. However, then the conversation came up with, well, are board members fully engaged in what's happening? And even though we had the committee meetings happen during the 2-day board meeting time frame, if you were not a board member on that committee, you were quiet during that presentation, but you could at least hear the conversation at the committee level, and then it was reported back out to the full board meeting, which then there was an ability to have a conversation. So as you hear that description, it sounded a bit redundant on some level because you sat through, if you were a member of that committee, you basically sat through kind of the presentation almost twice. However, again, that conversation about, well, is that more effective and were people more aware of what was being said at the committee meetings? Because all of us don't go to them. So in any case, I thought it was a great question. I don't have any kind of proposal or didn't have a thought about it, but I just thought that it was a great conversation. Thank you, Dr. Aguiar-Yardo, for bringing that up to us as board members. And I felt like his question to us was asking us to think about that moving forward. So I just thought it was important that we would put it on the agenda, that we could have this conversation as colleagues to figure out, is it good as it is, or do we need to revisit anything? That would be my context.
Okay. And I had a general comment. And I think we may all have different opinions about this, so this is just my personal opinion as it relates to the subject. When I first started observing the board, there would be breakout committee meetings during the board meeting, which I won't say that, but it felt a little bit like 8th grade social studies class to me. And my impression was that not much was accomplished in that context. And then oftentimes committee members wouldn't be able to attend a meeting of their committee, which usually lasted, 45 minutes an hour and 15 minutes?
Because they were concurrently happening.
Right.
Yeah.
So there were multiple committee meetings happening in the same room at the same time. I found that very ineffectual. So then when Ms. Sorek joined us, she had initially, with Dr. Erickson, they had organized it so the first day of the board meeting was largely delegated to having the committee meetings, and then the committee would report back to the full board either that day or the subsequent day. That, for me, and I'm kind of an impatient person, it did feel redundant to me. And I felt like we had 9 board members there to sit and listen to, or 6 board members sitting there and listening to a committee meeting that was occurring in front of them. And then it was the issues were being repeated the next day or whenever the committee reported back. So that didn't feel particularly effectual to me. Since that time, we've adopted our system where we have separate committee meetings. I think the separate committee meetings actually work really well. I think we've gotten, and there have been specific committees that have had greater agenda, a greater workload than others. I think we can all agree. But I felt like we've actually gotten some regulatory and legislative problems addressed or are in the process of being addressed. I feel like this is a very active board, and I'm very proud to be on this board because we are pushing ahead on so many different fronts at the same time. It is an inconvenience, I think, I will acknowledge this on behalf of the board members, to have additional responsibilities and to come additional days. But ultimately, our job as board members is to move forward the agenda of the board and in the interest of protecting the consumer and with due respect to our stakeholders. So I think that's been the most effectual system, but I'd be curious to hear what other people felt. I think it would be difficult to walk back, for instance, what we're doing in licensing committee right now and to try to do that during a board meeting. Most of the licensing committee meetings, at least for the first part of next year, are scheduled for 2 days. So we would probably either have to extend the length of each board meeting, but then we're going to have people sitting through 2 days of discussion or a day of discussion concerning continuing professional development or pathways to licensure that is going to feel, I think they're going to feel trapped in a room where they don't get to say anything. So I put that out there, and I'll be curious to hear what other people have to say.
I would just like to say on that after having seen and participated in both, I like this process that we're doing now because it truly, truly adheres to the deliberative process. It gives us an opportunity to ponder, to think, to have that small knit group where we can talk about things, think about things, move it forward, and then gives us time between the committee meeting and then when we come here, and yet then we get a larger input and things can still be changed. I think it would be valuable to keep it just like we have it. So that would be my take on it.
Good morning, Lucille. As a new board member, and this really truly being my official full court press here, I don't even understand what was the effectiveness of how you all had it before, because just the recaps and the reporting that we do, at least for me, I mean, I feel that they're very thorough, and so I don't understand what was the benefit of how you had it before.
I think
Can I-
you want to go ahead?
I think the other part that I didn't say in the context of the email was that also then the public members, we were able to hear them firsthand. And so the fact that if you are a member of the public and you're interested in a certain issue, you have to then attend multiple meetings. Not necessarily that it's a burden for board members, but ensuring that we did have I think that was part of the email, right?
That
Am
was
I
part of
recalling
it.
it correctly?
No, you're right.
Sometimes that issues come up. I don't know if it was the email.
Yeah, but
Either
that,
way, it's important.
that was the other issue in terms of the effectiveness. So if you were a member of the public tracking a certain issue, you were able to, and we were able to, while the recaps are great, thank you, staff, but you were able to hear from the actual person saying what the issue was. So you got a different sense, perhaps, maybe, questionable, if that was more effective or not. But you were then able to hear it as it was happening, and that would be the only other part. But it was, you listened, and then if you were in that situation where during the committee meeting, for instance, you remember the public,
Yeah.
you spoke, when it was presented back to the full board, you could speak again. And so, and again, it was kind of like a lot of times, a little bit perhaps redundant as part of the issue too. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah. And also, along with redundancy, the issue what could have been fleshed out even more. And that's where, and so when you said that, so it was kind of a 2 or maybe 3-pronged situation. Redundancy, yes. And then the time that it was given, it was like, wait a minute.
Not nearly enough.
That's exactly right. Not nearly enough. But now as I look back and look at what we're doing now and this process, it's less redundant, far more powerful in the making of the decision, because now you have the opportunity to ponder it, to look at it, and make that decision. For example, and let me kind of give you an example of what it looked like. For example, we would meet, and then the board member who was heading that particular committee would then work with the committee members, and we would literally kind of parse off in sections of the room, and then that board member would lead the discussion. And of course, everyone was invited. And just like you're saying, if you were following this, let's say if you were following licensing, and then there was enforcement, so you were kind of torn between where am I going to go? Right. But you had 2 issues that you were following, so that was a challenge. Then the other part. And then there, of course, were time constraints, and those time constraints added to that we understood that we needed to get it done in a time constraint manner. And so that kind of added to, okay, so we did have a chance to really flesh it out, okay. Then When it came back to the board that same day, then it was reported out. And in that reporting out, maybe some questions, or just people needed to pull back and think about it. That time was highly constrained. And so now, with it being done like this, it just opens it up to even more. So that's why, after having looked at both, and I can understand what you all are saying, so yeah. And thank you for bringing it up.
So was the participation before, was there more participation from the professionals within the other setting, or do we find that it's the same?
It was, the participation, how can I say, the participation was there, but you didn't have the time to really kind of dive into it. And the participation, as far as it was just the people who were there at that moment. And now we have expanded the participation pool, because now, as we report out, all of the folks who are here now have an opportunity, who might not have been at that other meeting when the committee meetings were there. Now they have an opportunity to kind of weigh in on that. So we are expanding the pool. The reports are there, so people have a time to just really kind of dive into it, think about it, and ask questions. So, yeah. Does that make sense?
And my comment, adding to yours, and I agree that I like the system we have much better. You were asking how did it make sense before. In retrospect, I don't think it made sense.
It doesn't sound like it,
No.
no.
No, it made sense.
But it felt like going to a convention maybe, and you have different seminars going on, and you kind
Yeah,
of look to
that's
see
it.
where you want to visit and what looks interesting, and we want to do more than that,
Right.
and I think we're able to now.
Well, I just think when we look through our reports of what we've completed to date through community outreach, there's so many items that have been completed. It just feels like we are on an upbound trajectory of just getting things done, which, really speaks to our efforts.
And let me just say this. Thank you for mentioning that, because classic example, out of that, and while the outreach community met and all of that, out of that, after we had an opportunity to talk about it, additional thoughts came out of that. For example, those additional thoughts. Now, let's say if we were doing it the old-fashioned way, we might not revisit that again until next board meeting. And so now, when the outreach committee meet again, there are pieces of information that we might want to put into that to make it even richer. But under the old system, we would have, our next meeting is February, so we would be waiting to meet and have that conversation in February. Thank you.
And I think also that in between, we were able to then ask staff to pull together stuff for us, which we didn't before. And I think, like yesterday's conversation about like telehealth, which is what we were calling it then, that went on for several months, because we had, and I forgot that description of it, like, because you only had 45 minutes, you may not have gotten through your agenda of all the items, even if you had it. And if you were a member of the public and you had two interests that were competing, so like, the conference model is a great one. You were like maybe sitting in 5 minutes and then going to the other one. So it was a little disjointed.
Well, and I also feel that under the previous system, the way that it was, we would have a hard time getting guests to attend like we did for the telehealth, where we were able to coordinate. I just, in my opinion, I like this, and I think it's much more effective, and that's just me.
So it sounds like a consensus is developing that people feel comfortable with the new system that we've implemented, despite the burdens it puts on board members and stakeholders to spend more time on these issues, that it tends to be a more effective system in terms of actually advancing our agenda as a board and getting things accomplished. Is there anybody else that would like to make additional comments?
Well, I just want to add that for all the committee meetings, they are still open to the public. So there may be numbers that people call into, or, office places where people can go, or their webcasts. So it does still give the public opportunity to participate. I just will reiterate, I do think it's gives us some more opportunity to really have a thoughtful and deliberative process in the committee work. So.
And again, as I said, I didn't have an opinion on this issue at all. I just wanted to close up the conversation. But I do think what you said, Dr. Horne, is really important. And I do think that, our conversation yesterday about how we decide to notice things, I think that that goes back to our value of transparency to make sure, because I think we've also seen recently, Ms. Sorek, I think I might be right on this one, we've gotten a lot more handwritten comments ahead of time of some meetings where we have people weighing in, and that we can also just continue to make that option available and known. But I do think we have the telephone lines. That really is a helpful thing. And so, I would agree that it's more thoughtful and participatory in a more full, in-depth kind of way.
So is there any motion that's being made here by anyone? I don't know that a motion is necessary, given the tenor of the comments. Are there any comments from the public? Hearing none, we will move on to our next agenda. Okay. Yeah. Item number 21 is the election of officers for this coming calendar year. And to that end, I'm going to turn this particular task over to Ms. Marks.
The board has a choice in how it wants to go about it. You can do slates. You can do each office at a time. I actually think that's probably a little easier, a little cleaner to do just one office at a time, one officer at a time. What I would suggest is that you start with one office and take the nominations for that particular office and vote, and then go on to the next office. If that sounds okay to everybody? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It sounds okay to me, and can I start the process?
Sure.
I'd like to nominate Dr. Stephen Phillips for President of the Board of Psychology.
I
I know he's
second.
very interested in continuing to serve, and we appreciate his service.
Okay, so we're going to start with the office of the president or the chair. I think it's usually called the president for this board, okay?
Second.
I second. Oh. Wanted to second third.
Nominations actually don't require a second, but that's
Okay.
okay. And are there any other nominations then for the office of president?
Is there any discussion?
I would take all the nominations first, and then I would recommend, then you would have this discussion. Are there any other nominations for president? Okay. You can have discussion, and then I would take public comment.
I also, again, don't necessarily have a position on this, but I do feel like it was another situation that was brought forward to us from one of our outgoing board members. There was a conversation about ensuring that we really look at how we have public and licensed members serving, and there was a suggestion that maybe the presidency should be a rotating kind of situation. I just throw that out there into the public sphere for discussion, perhaps, but I fully support my nomination of Dr. Stephen Phillips, who is a licensed member, and I know our previous president was a licensed member as well. But I definitely just feel like that's an important idea and notion to keep in mind, given our conversation over the last 2 years about how we look at our roles as board members. But again, I fully support Dr. Phillips.
I agree.
I have a question. Do we normally take public comment on election of officers? I don't recall that we do.
Yes.
Do public on everything.
Well,
There may not have been any, but
But
you
you
need.
should have.
You need to call for public comment, yes.
Let me just say, I support Dr. Phillips as well. I think he's done a marvelous job, just as Dr. Erickson did as well. And I need to say that. I think some of the changes that we have seen in the board have been wonderful. So congratulations to both, and good choice. Good choice.
Is there any other board discussion? Is there any public comment before the board votes on the office of the president? Okay, so the motion is to elect Stephen Phillips as the president of the board for calendar year 2017. Okay. And
For the vote.
we do need to record each vote, but we can do it by a show of hands as long as staff records each vote, just because, or I can call
Just
it.
call
Yeah.
Call roll?
Yeah.
Okay. Alita Brunel. I'm just going to do it as I see you. Alita Brunel.
Yes.
Jackie Horne.
Yes.
Stephen Phillips.
Yes.
Nicole Jones.
Yes.
Michael Erickson.
Yes.
Lucila Cueta-Budu.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. The next office would be the vice president, and all nominations.
I would like, oh, go ahead.
Well, I'd like to nominate Ms. Nicole Jones to be vice president of the board.
Second.
We don't need a second.
Don't need a second, but I wanted to do
I
it anyway.
agree. I agree because I wanted to do it. Okay.
Are there any other nominations for vice president? Okay. Is there any board discussion?
I have board discussion. So, I think Ms. Jones has done a great job as vice president. I think, well, I'll just say that she's done a great job as vice president. Also, I think that just in light of what you were talking about earlier, our board is comprised of public and licensed members, and I think that combination is always a good combination. It just reminds us that all the voices and perspectives are important, and so I think it's really nice to have that in our leadership, so that's why.
And also, I think you're a good team. So, I really do. So, yeah. That's right, your birthdays are not the same, but you're a good team.
Is there any other board discussion? Is there any public comment?
What happens if you do this?
Okay, I will call the roll. Alita Brunel,
Yes.
Jackie Horne,
Yes.
Stephen Phillips,
Yes.
Nicole Jones.
Yes.
Michael Erickson,
Yes.
Lucila Cueta-Budu.
Yes.
Okay. So the motion carries to elect Nicole Jones as vice president for calendar year 2017.
Congratulations, you too.
Congratulations, guys. Yeah.
Okay, so now, sometimes we can be really efficient, sometimes not. But we're going to now return to item number 14, which is a legislation update. And apropos of the election, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Ms. Jones.
Thank you, Dr. Phillips. Good morning again. We are going to skip down and tab number 14. We'll take item number C3 first, because we definitely know there's some public members that are here regarding this matter. And so if you could turn to your books, tab 14, C3.
And just to draw members of the public and the board to the hand carry, which has the blue and red font on it. This proposal has been submitted to Ledge Council by Assembly Member Levine, which his staff did on their own as placeholder language, and then they're waiting for feedback from the board on the language. The changes in the red and blue are from Legislative Council for the board's consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Sorek. And as I lead into the background on this matter, I just say this twice probably during my report. I want to thank staff. Thank you, Ms. Burns and Mr. Glass-Steagall, for your efforts in organizing this material and giving us a very succinct overview as well as kind of a recollection of what happened, right? We've got a good chronology here. I'm going to also just prime Dr. Horne and Dr. Phillips, because this matter has come to the policy. It's being reported out as a part of the Policy and Advocacy Committee, but a lot of the work, the heavy lifting was done in licensing. So I'm going to start off, but please cut me off, Dr. Horne, as chair of that committee, or Dr. Phillips, please cut me off if I missed something on that. As you might recall, Board, the Licensing Committee brought a motion to you all in the May meeting, and you all asked us to take it back to review the information for this matter about, and in terms of the history, we were responding to the veto message from the governor regarding AB
2198.
2198, yes, thank you. And basically, the concern was that given our other parallel track of activity on updating and reviewing CPD, continuing professional development, several board members at the time were concerned that we were deviating from our initial plan and adding additional requirements that were not in line with our major overhaul discussion about CPD. And again, that process has been a parallel track for a little bit over a year and a half, and some of that efforts have changed given the work that we've been doing on that. But I think that's important context just to keep in mind. As a licensing committee at our September meeting, we took a look at it and looked at the language once again, and really had a great discussion, I think, beyond just about the language, but also in terms of the intent. Because one of the things the licensing committee was concerned about was, one, addressing the concerns of board members initially when it first came to us, when the veto message happened, but also we felt like we had done a lot of work. We had hosted several meetings, committee meetings, where we had stakeholders that came, and the committee had taken into consideration the concerns that were raised, and we thought we had a proposal that was meeting what the committee wanted to recommend. And when we came back to it, we wanted to then take that into consideration, that we wanted to do the heavy lifting again, but we also wanted to ensure that we covered the bases, but then also present this to you all as a opportunity to look at what's happening, but to really discuss it as opposed to then kicking it back to the committee, because we have done the work a couple of times, and we feel like we had come with this type of proposal and felt that we really needed to have you vote it up or down as opposed to returning it back to the committee. And then since that time, we have prepared this material, and again, as Ms. Sorek mentioned about the placeholder language. So I'll stop right now, but Dr. Horne, is that accurate, or is it something I'm missing?
Yeah, there's I think the things I'd like to add is, as Ms. Jones said, this has come to us a few times, and but there were two things I think that really guided the licensing committee, and y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but one was we didn't want to create something for potential licensees to do that, or for our licensees to do that they had already had. We didn't want to. We didn't want to make an extra burden. I mean, that was not our intent. But the other thing was we did want to take the governor's veto message and respond to it and recognize that this is an important issue. In California, again, y'all can read the materials there. This is a very serious issue. And whereas I think we understand that a lot of times people who commit suicide or who are suicidal threats don't come to psychologists prior to, say, committing suicide or attempting suicide. We still felt that this was important, again, to acknowledge the governor's veto, what he said in his veto, and also to say that may be true, but we know this is an important issue and we want to make that statement. So I think those were two guiding things for us in our deliberations. So just wanted to say that. Yeah.
And I think the other thing apropos this topic, which is obviously a very important one, particularly in the field of mental health, and to the people that are affected by other people's suicides, whether it's family members or spouses or good friends. It's a devastating experience to have somebody suicide in your life. I've had that experience, actually. All that being said, given the amount of deliberation that's happened within the licensing committee, I think, unanimously felt that we're handing this to the board through the Policy and Advocacy Committee, and that this is, don't send it back to us. I guess is the best way to put it, because I think we've put as much thought and deliberation into it as we can, and we really need the board to, if they want to formulate the final language, but we really need board action on this as opposed to putting it over for another 3 months and worrying the details again, because I think we've exhausted the possibilities from our point of view.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. Thank you, Dr. Phillips. And I will just say, to, I guess, clarify what Dr. Phillips just said, just FYI, it's being reported out as this from Policy and Advocacy. The Policy and Advocacy Committee did not review it yet, so it's just being reported out at this point in time. So I know that my colleague on the Policy and Advocacy Committee might have something to say. But at that point, this is basically the baseline. Ms. Sorg, Ms. Marks, I think I said everything right from our captured. I think I want to open it up to board discussion, and basically where we are at is we are at a point where staff recommends the approval of this, the suicide risk assessment and the intervention coursework requirement proposal. So any board members have any questions or concerns, and then of course we'll open it up to public comment.
You know, I've had a thought about this within the last several weeks when I taught a class to a group of postdoctoral students, and I asked them how much suicide training they felt like they'd had. Some of them had received excellent training within the context of their education. Some of them had received excellent training in the context of working at a particular training site, and some of them felt like they knew very little about it and had really never gotten much in the way of instruction. So I think it's particularly important that that people that are coming into the field are thoroughly capable of dealing with a suicide situation, whether it's as to assessment or intervention or knowing when they're in over their head. But in order to do that, you have to assess the situation. The second thing is that I think the experience of people within the field is very differential in terms of whether they've seen a lot of suicidal patients or not. People that obviously work in a hospital setting have seen more suicidal patients. People that work at psychiatric facilities. And within my practice, I know that I've seen a disproportionate number of suicidal people. But I do think it's very important that we make sure that all professionals in the field also are thoroughly trained in the subject, even if they only see one suicidal person in the rest of their career, which is highly unlikely, trust me. It is something that comes up in psychotherapy a lot, whether it's in the form of people having passive suicidal ideation, I wish I could lay down and never get up again, but they're not necessarily threatening suicide, all the way to people telling you what their plan is to commit suicide. So I think it's a subject that appropriately the governor sent back to the board, or the boards and to other agencies, but I think it's very important that we act on this.
I would like just to add as a legal matter, and Ms. Sorg can correct me if I'm wrong, at this point the board would be essentially approving the proposal to go to the legislature. The board will see it again when it comes back as proposed legislation.
Actually, we're a little farther along in the process, given that Assemblymember Levine has already submitted placeholder language that was discussed at the licensing committee meeting to Legislative Council. So placeholder language is already in, and I think at this stage it would be the board reviewing and considering the language that Legislative Council, the hand carry with the red and blue font, and moving forward, and when it does become a bill, the position that the board would take on that legislation.
To what extent?
So the board will see it again.
To what extent, and this could be answered by Ms. Burns or Ms. Sorick, to what extent do you feel the placeholder language is consistent with the proposal?
I reviewed the placeholder language that you have right here. It's very consistent. So they wanted to be more specific, not just to one part, but it re-references the other part. So you have to have, it's got to be CPD, but it meets those two different types of coursework. So they were just trying to clarify which sections. That's really all it was. It was clarifying language of what actual requirement versus the two types of the requirement are.
And for the benefit of people that aren't familiar with our terminology, we use a lot of acronyms.
Yes, we do.
CPD is continuing professional development.
And they were trying to make sure that was consistent with SB 1193, our sunset bill, so they are referencing the language that will go into effect in January of 2017 that we have all approved and advocated for as part of our sunset bill, so.
Any other board questions or discussion? And thank you for saying that, because it would have come after the adoption of the sunset review bill. But yes, so we now are we're in the rubric of CPD. And so this does match the law.
Do schools and our professionals feel about additional training in this area? Do we have a sense of that at all?
Well, Dr. Phillips, you can carry on, but you might recall that this was an issue that our former board member, Dr. Harlem, was working on. What is John's last name? Mr. Burke. Hi, Mr. Burke. Mr. Burke did a survey of the schools, and we felt like that was the kind of I think I was going to say the crossroad where we were at last time. I think we were, as a board, we basically were saying that the first part of this language about coursework for applicants kind of was something that was already happening. It was the additional CPD requirement, which, as Dr. Horne mentioned, is a part of the discussion at the licensing committee. We realized, and as you said, Dr. Phillips, about just ensuring that the one-time requirement would ensure that the field would be covered. But we didn't feel like it was going to be so, even though you just reported on what your students have said, we felt like for the most part that was already being done by a lot of the educational institutions.
And I guess to that point, I think this will, in some ways, get educational institutions to focus on the specific content that they use for purposes of this. Sometimes it's spread out over a number of courses, so depending on who's, especially in the larger programs like the professional schools, depending on who you have, they cover it more in depth or less in depth. I do think there's a lot of really good training that's done around this. I don't want to offend training directors, but I think we need to make sure that there's a consistency, and I think one way we can do that is to make sure that the schools are focused on the fact that they need to be able to certify to us
That they're doing.
that it's actually been done during the course of the curriculum, or the candidate needs to find another way to prove to us that that's the case.
Or
So
it's in a
less.
practicum or postdoctoral setting.
And Mr. Quayle, before you finish on that, because I want to just pick up on what Dr. Phillips was just saying, that was a part of the discussion too, how we would certify it. And for that reason, in terms of the different points at which you might get the training, and that is why you'll see here on line number 10, we put both the registrar or training director, because we weren't quite sure how people would record that, but we wanted to ensure that there was satisfactory completion of the requirement.
So thank you all for that. So this is in an attempt that this will become a part of the school's curriculum. Eventually, hopefully.
Actually, no. It might, but it might be that they get it in a practicum experience, an internship, a postdoc. In other words, there are plenty of places along the graduate training all the way through all their supervised experience, that trainees have the opportunity to get this. So we're not saying it has to be in the graduate school curriculum.
I know we're not saying it has to be now, but as it moves forward, there's a high probability that it might become a part of. I'm just asking. Might? No,
Well,
I mean, I know you don't have a definitive
I
answer,
don't.
but
And also, I mean, I think the way typically graduate training in psychology is, it wouldn't necessarily be a course
Okay.
in suicide assessment and prevention. It might be something about crisis intervention.
Okay.
So it's a broader
Okay.
topic, and that's why we didn't want to
Okay.
specify that, but
Very
we
well.
want that we want that content to be covered
Yeah.
somewhere, and we want somebody to say, yes, this student got that content. Where it's covered,
doesn't matter.
we really didn't want to
Fine.
make any
Okay.
pronouncements.
But it sounds like it could
It could.
be
It could.
it could be weaved through that in some kind of way, and that's what I'm trying to get at. The question is, would it probably be woven through through a school's whatever curriculum,
Absolutely could
whatever,
be.
maybe so that's where I'm going with this, and that's the way as I'm looking at it, that's the way that I come away from it. Over time, it will become a very integral part of the way that the practice is done, that psychology is done.
I'm not sure that that's necessarily true, but I think it will get a focus within the educational
That's all I'm saying.
institutions and
Right.
the training programs for it. I actually received suicide training, I think, 3 or 4 times. I usually always got it at my practicum or my internships or my postdoc. I also got it in classes. Some classes were piecemeal. Now, when I went to graduate school, you had more room for electives. That has become more difficult with the increasing requirements for accreditation. But I think I took a 2 full day course in suicide assessment intervention, because that was a population that was of particular interest to me. So I think there's lots of opportunities, but we want to make sure that somebody's going to stand up and say, yes, they've gotten sufficient training in this,
Okay.
or they've gotten
That's
at
fair.
least the amount of training
Yeah.
that we're requiring.
Okay, great. All right. Okay.
Oh, no, I just said I get it, because I think it's very clear on line 30, right, effective January 1st as a one-time requirement. I mean, it's very
Yeah.
clear to me, yeah.
Yeah, and that's why I was wanting to make sure that we would, okay.
Well, the one-time requirement is, yes, so either you've got it before licensure, or you've gotten it as a part of CPD.
Thank you.
Any other board questions or comments? So I guess I would say, given what Ms. Marks and Ms. Sorick said, can we entertain a motion before we open it up to public comment, or do we feel like we're at the place of that before we open it up to public comment? You please tell me which way we should go.
I'm wondering, Ms. Marks, if we need a motion from the board to begin working with Assemblymember Levine's office on the language that's been presented, and once it becomes a bill, unless it's substantively changed, that the board would support the legislation? I'm not sure.
I think the first part, yes.
Okay. I wasn't sure procedurally, because bill introduction is typically at the end of February, and we'll have our board meeting before that time. So I just wanted to make sure we had the ability to, if the movement was going to be to support this language, that staff had the ability to work with the Assembly Member's office on going back and forth on the language and whatever support they need in that regard.
Yeah, I think a motion is a good idea because it's essentially a board-sponsored bill. So if you want to move forward with that, I think a motion is a good idea. I just wanted to follow up on something that Dr. Phillips said and just make sure I understand. I think it's line 12, where it says, so that there's going to be the certification stating that the coursework required by this section is included within the institution's curriculum for graduation. Because of the potential issue with required curriculum for graduation versus an elective? Do we need to say required? Because I want to be sure that it's not something that the certification is, yes, we offer that, without a specific certification that it's either required for graduation, or that it was an elective that was taken. I think the second part of that indicates that it was coursework that was completed, but I think if it's just going to be certification that it's part of the curriculum, that it's part of the required curriculum. And I don't know if that's necessary or not, because I don't know how they're generally organized.
Can I ask a question, though? If you took out the comma, would it be that you're certifying that either it's part of the curriculum or it's part of the coursework completed? I think that if the comma was removed, even though we did lots of wordsmithing with commas, doesn't that mean a different thing about the certification? It would either be...
I think that's my question, because I don't know if curriculum includes everything that's required for graduation plus any potential electives. And you may have to take a certain number of electives to get the number of units. It's just not sure whether or not that means that every part of the curriculum is required for graduation. So I just wanted to clarify that. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying, I think, and that is that there's a way that an institution could certify that it was within their curriculum, but it wouldn't necessarily be a class the student completed. So instead of or, should it be and? The coursework?
No, it shouldn't be and.
Okay. How about included within the institution's required curriculum for graduation?
Or within the
curriculum.
coursework that
Right,
the student took, so.
Right.
Right.
Either one.
Right,
So
right,
it's
right.
either the curriculum that is required for graduation, because so there are certain things you have to take, and it is one of those, or it's an elective and the person did take it. So I would just say if that's the case, then you need to add in required after curriculum.
And I think that was the intent of the conversation at the committee level.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dr.
I'm confused a little. Isn't required pertaining to the section rather than the curriculum? The coursework required by this section pertains to the section, not the school and what the curriculum is, isn't it?
Right, and that's why I want to be sure that the certification is that this training, the training, the course is part of the curriculum required for graduation. So it's what's required by the section, and it's either required in order to graduate, or it's an elective and it was taken by the student.
That's what
I'm
wanna
trying
say.
to get at. So I'm not sure if you need to add the word
How about this?
required after curriculum.
That the coursework required by this section is either required for graduation or within the coursework that was completed by the applicant.
I think that does capture the
Yeah.
spirit of the conversation.
Yeah. Either it's required or the student took it, and whoever we've identified is certifying to that. Yeah.
So therefore, it doesn't necessarily right now have to be a part of the curriculum?
Lucille?
Correct.
Oh, I'm sorry. So it doesn't necessarily right now have to be a part of the curriculum?
Of the required curriculum,
Uh-huh.
no. And we
Okay.
don't want to make it.
I understand,
that way.
because that was
Yeah.
where I was kind of, thank you,
Right.
Noreen. That's where I was kind of going with that.
Yeah.
So that's consistent with what is, okay.
So
That's
just
helpful.
so I know I
Thank you.
understand this correctly, a graduate of a qualifying school could show by completing elective coursework and meet the requirement set forth in the curriculum requirement. It wouldn't have to be in the curriculum required for graduation, but they could take an elective course, and the head of that school or registrar could certify to that fact, and that would meet the requirement of that section.
And I think the part about the certification is the most important part, because that was the conversation that staff was not able, or we didn't want to require, that they are then looking through transcripts to figure out which is the actual coursework that would be meet the eligibility. It would be the certification.
And just to add, I think that we don't want to get in the business of managing an institution's curriculum. In part, they have enough pressure on them already to try to meet all the requirements that they're supposed to hit. It's gotten to the point where in some of the programs, people are only allowed to take 1 or 2 elective courses in the course of their whole doctorate. So I think we don't want to add to that burden, but we do want to make sure that the training's been done at some point or another.
Okay.
And some of the institutions actually, through their continuing education arm, will provide a pre-licensure course if they can't get the certification, so they can actually go to something that looks like a continuing education class. So there'll be a variety of different ways that they can do it and get the certification.
So let me also say, it doesn't have to be something in a classroom. That's our part two. We're saying it can be in an applied experience that the person has had during their training. So it can be in a practicum setting, an internship, a postdoc, or in any other kind of supervised professional experience. So it didn't happen in a classroom, but they're getting the experiential, so it's essentially education and training in that as well.
So what I'm also hearing, that it would be left up to the schools to parse this out in a way that they could get that certification that is needed. That's what I'm hearing. Or am I hearing right? That it would be left up to the institution
I think the institution doesn't have to do anything necessarily to comply with this. It's the student that's looking for a way to get the certification. Is that
But
correct?
And if they don't get it anywhere in their graduate
That's what
training,
I'm
then
saying.
they'll probably have to take a course before they get licensed.
Okay.
You know.
So I'm
a
still saying the
6-hour course.
institution will be aware of that. So the
Could be.
institutions would be aware. Oh, I hear you.
Yeah.
They would be sensitive or aware to that, aware to the training is needed, so they could provide that.
Mr. Claypool, let me just say this too, because I do think it's important that we were not trying to mandate any kind of
I
curriculum.
understand.
But I do think what you're saying is an important issue, which is what the licensing committee, I think when we had public comment, probably 3 or 4 meetings ago, is that clearly with this policy, we are impacting probably.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I thought I hit it. I think that we are impacting possibly the way policies will be done. And the fact is, it goes back to what Dr. Horne started off by saying. Given the importance of this issue, much like all of the other, which I don't know the codes off the top of my head, over time, when we've had these one-time requirements, it was a policy move to address an important issue in the community. So what schools will do, we don't know, and we haven't had any stakeholders come to the meeting to share with that. But I think that that's what was one of the things that did come up, that clearly by having it here, there would be bringing some light and attention to the issue, and that applicants would then be looking at, okay, how do I satisfy this one-time requirement? It does. And I think that we said also as licensing committee, and please correct me if I'm wrong, committee members here, that we really took to heart the fact that we don't want to be extra burdensome given the requirements already established. However, we thought that our role as a regulatory board was important to address issues as they come up. So this would not be something we do for every issue, but that this was enough to give us pause and to address the veto message that was given back to the boards. How do we deal with this important issue? Much like in the past, aging and domestic violence were issues that our predecessors dealt with in regulatory boards. But I do think that we were very conscious about that, like not wanting to require people to say it's 6 hours as a course, because we didn't want to prescribe and really tell folks what to do.
I was just going to add that to me, it does make it very clear that you put it back on the student, and it's very clear on line 30 where it just, that as a one-time requirement, a licensee prior to the time of his or her renewal. I mean, to me, that's just very clear that it definitely is up to the student to know this is what you need to do and that you are addressing this very important issue.
And again, in a way not to be burdensome, too, right? Yes, and it's an important issue. And I guess I also wanted to say it differently, because as you said, Ms. Sork and Ms. Marks, what we would be looking for is a motion. I guess really the question is there a motion to move forward or to not move forward? Is really the question.
I so move.
I second that.
I would like to say that I think this is a very important issue. I haven't added that specifically, and also I'm appreciative of the stakeholders who've taken the time to write letters and make comments here at our meetings in the past year or so. This is an incredibly important issue for many people, those who've lost someone to suicide, and I think this gives us an opportunity to, as a regulatory body, help ensure that there's training available for our licensees. So I'm thankful to the people that have persisted in giving us input, and very thankful for the committee's work in getting us to this place.
Ms. Burns?
Can I have Dr. Horne, please, give me the language so that we have the exact language you wanted there on the included within either required, we just need the language that you had on the required part in section 1.
I think I have it as, which the applicant graduated stating that the coursework required by this section is either required for graduation or within the coursework that was completed by the applicant. Is that correct, Dr. Horne? Okay.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to be clear before we went any further. And that the motion we have on the floor is motion to move forward with this proposal with Assemblymember Levine's office.
Correct. Is there any more further board discussion?
But Ms. Marks, is that the right language? Because I think, was there another step? Should it be not to move forward with the office, or, yeah, because you said we have to then adopt, if it became a bill, we would be a different type of motion. I just want to make sure that was the right motion to say it, just moving forward, or is it moving forward with
No, I
Levine's
think it's just
office?
moving forward at this point.
Yeah, I think we strike the Levine's office. It's just moving forward.
Well, I think you're moving forward with Levine's office as the
Okay,
author.
okay.
Right, and
But
then there
that's
will
part
be.
of the proposal.
That's part of the proposal, is to move forward with
Okay.
Levine's office for the proposal, and then if and when it comes back to the board, proposed
Gotcha.
legislation, there'll be a different motion.
Thank you for that clarification. I thought there was a step before that one, in terms of, but no, thank you. Okay. Is there any more, and again, thank you for jumping in there. I just wanted to state that we weren't just accepting a motion to move forward. If someone was wanting to make a motion for us to stop the process, we wanted to accept that as also as a motion. Any other board comment on that? Is there any public comment on the motion? Please come forward to the microphone. And if you could state your name, please, and if you could hit the right button, unlike I did. Oh, it's already on?
It's green.
Yeah, you're
It's already
perfect.
on.
You're golden.
Dr. Melody Schaefer, Division II of the California Psychological Association. I'm concerned about Section 1. It seems a bit of a muddle to me in terms of academic programming, since schools are not going to be able to have a separate standalone class for the right reasons that Dr. Phillips has stated. It's hard enough for them to meet the mandates. And basically, you're asking them to give a certification for whatever piecemeal elements of suicidality training can happen over a myriad of different courses. It seems to me that would be much cleaner and be able to better substantiate that the quality of training necessary in this would be conducted if you instead, and sorry for suggesting something so radical to what you brought, but to scrap that idea, instead have it one of the pre-licensing courses that would be taken and mandated before they could sit for licensure. That way you could have some, for lack of a better word, control over the content, and it would be encased in a much more meaningful way. I've done years of suicidality training within the Veterans Administration over 16 years, and there's a lot of components when you really do excellent training in this area. And although in my doctorate program, as Dr. Phillips indicated in his, we, and I'm sure Dr. Horne would say the same, you have pieces of this interwoven into crisis intervention or interviewing skills or assessment skills, but not typically the kind of robust nature of what I think is really being aspired towards, which is important. So that may be another way to think of it. I would not see this topic as any less important than that we already have for domestic violence and substance abuse and child abuse and things of that ilk. So maybe that's a way to kind of bring it home in a way that would be a bit more meaningful and that could truly be an attestation to what you're aspiring to have accomplished. Thanks.
Go right ahead, Dr. Horne.
So thank you, Dr. Schaefer. Actually, we thought of that and specifically, and we have that as an option. And if one of our 3 options, ways that you can get this training, and if in a particular program, if it is dispersed in a way that makes it, that puts a different kind of onus or burden on the director of training or whoever, then it might not occur that way for purposes of counting it. You know, it might be too much of a burden. We don't know. But we wanted to give all those options and didn't want to include something. If people had already had that training and had good training and that could be attested to, or they could have proof about that, we didn't want to then create an extra burden for people to take it prior to initial licensure or renewing a license. So we included all those options, and that was our reason for it. So.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I might suggest that the board might want to consider changing perhaps the vernacular from coursework, which most people take to mean a freestanding course, to speaking in terms of certification that the collective course content within the doctoral program was robust enough to fulfill this. I think that's important from the standpoint that many will get confused upon what it means by coursework and will think that means an actual 3-hour course or whatever unit course, and by talking about the content and it collectively meeting the mark, the intended degree of intensity, that may be a better way to go. Thank you.
Anything else? Thank you. Any other public comment? Please come forward.
Hi, I'm Dr. Elizabeth Winkleman. I'm with the California Psychological Association, so thank you for offering us the opportunity for public comment. I wanted to just bring up again a question for clarification about the second manner in which the training and experience can be obtained, and that is regarding the applied experience. And in particular, looking at, it's described as, and the reason why I'm making this comment is because right now I think it's kind of unclear. And if I were on my internship or postdoc training or providing supervision in that setting, I would be wondering, am I really going to be able to attest to this requirement being completed? Because in line 15, you talk about applied experience, and in other parts of this proposed language. Yet in line 21, it says that you must certify that stating that the coursework required by this section is included within the experience. So if you intend for it to be completed at the practicum level at coursework provided at the practicum, then that should be made clear. Or if it is intended that you can have applied training or experience that would satisfy the requirement, then you might be able to clarify that by, in line 21, saying something stating that the training and experience required by this section is included within the practicum experience, or some such thing. So that just a request for you to consider that and potentially clarify that.
And I think that's also what Dr. Schaefer was getting to, and that does make sense because people will think coursework is in a class, and I think we are talking about training and experience, and it is the content we're talking about.
Yes.
So.
And it sounds like that Ms. Zork was helping with some language.
Some language.
So we'll let them finish, and then we can go over what those that might be.
Okay, that sounds good. Thanks.
Go ahead, please.
Hello, I'm Che Hernandez. I am currently serve as Board of Directors Chair for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention here in San Diego County. And I'm in favor of adopting the coursework language. For me, I wanted to thank you all for all the hard work you've done and the comments and discussion. And I also appreciate the comments given by the two previous public comment folks. And, this is a personal issue for me. I'm a systems analyst by profession. I lost my nephew to suicide 7 years ago, and I know I can't bring him back, but going forward in this type of thing, I know can make a difference in people's lives. And as a layperson, I assumed that all mental health professionals have a level of mastery in the area of suicide prevention, and I learned that that isn't the case. So all I'm doing is asking for partnership of what we can put in, what's missing, what can we put in place that would make a difference for anyone and everyone. So that's the underlying sentiment, is what more can be done. So I appreciate everything that you've already done so far. We know that there's a lot of gifted and talented psychologists out there, and we know that they're in the field because they want to make a difference for their clients and for the world. And so I think adopting this language is a step in the right direction for what we're already doing. It's an added tool, maybe more information they can bring to their own practice that can make a difference for their clients, and not just for a moment in time, but for a lifetime for their clients. Adopting the message also sends a message of empowerment to psychologists. You've already stated that this issue is important. So then they're seeing that if they haven't already sought out areas that they could add to their expertise, then now's the time to do that. It sends an empowerment message to clients. There are many people out there that they're not sure when they approach a certain mental health professional, psychologist, whether they have a mastery in the area, whether they're willing to deal with suicide. And it also represents leadership for the rest of the states. We've done a lot in California already, and other states, look to us for leadership, and that's just, how it is. Conversely, not adopting this language, well, it kind of sends a different message, that, we're satisfied of how things are, and that everything is fine and everything is working. So, I just want you to consider, something I think about in my own, business and things, is that you can take a small action today that can have a huge impact downstream. And so I always, kind of take that approach. It's like, what's the smallest thing that we can do today? What actions can we take? I thank you, for your consideration. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Was it Mr. Hernandez? What was your last name?
Hernandez,
Okay,
yes.
okay. Thank you, Mr. Hernandez. I just wanted to make sure I heard it. Thank you.
Very helpful, thank you.
Thank you for your comments. That was very nice.
Is there any other public comment as they approach? I just wanted to say that we also received 2 letters from others that are unable to join us. And as you take your seat, I'll just say their names. Victor Ojakian wrote a letter of support. And we also received a letter from Craig Lomax, a suicide prevention advocate, who sent a letter of support. Did we need to we didn't need to read these, did we? Okay, fantastic. So there's copies outside. Please go right ahead.
Hello, and thank you for opening up for public comment. My name is David Bond. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, have been for about 16 years, largely working in large healthcare and mental health facilities. But for the last 4 years, I've been the Vice President of Programs at the Trevor Project, which is the nation's leading organization providing crisis intervention and suicide prevention services to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning youth under the age of 25. I have about 3 pages of prepared comments, but I don't want to be redundant, so I'm actually going to skip over most of them. I wanted to respond to something I was triggered to think about earlier and mention that 40% of people who die by suicide have seen their primary care physician within a month of their death. 25% of mental health providers and 50% of psychiatrists will have a client who dies by suicide. Of all of the training that psychologists, social workers, and MFT receive over years of formal education and clinical practice, nothing will actually save more lives than a comprehensive suicide assessment and intervention training. When I was in graduate school, when we discussed issues of diversity, and this is social work, so we discuss diversity all the time, and inevitably, we would go through racial and ethnic minorities, religious minorities, socioeconomic status differences, and LGBT issues would get the last 5 to 10 minutes of the class if there was still time, because teachers were not necessarily comfortable of knowing how to discuss it. My anxiety about having crisis training as sufficient to cover suicide is that suicide will get that last 5 to 10 minutes of the class as well. I have been a psychotherapist for 12 of those years. I never received adequate suicide assessment and intervention training in all of my years at graduate school and in clinical practice. It wasn't until I joined the suicide prevention community that I realized that doing a contract for suicide safety is the most ridiculous thing a clinician can do. It just doesn't make impact. So I would highly encourage very specific training. And the training that I would echo the person who said requiring it as a pre-credentialing class where you could actually have more control over what the content is going to be. I would really strongly advocate for that, because within that, it's not only how to do an assessment and how to intervene, but also really taking a look at very specific high-risk groups like Native Americans, like veterans, and like LGBT young people, who are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide than their straight peers. And transgender youth, 41% of transgender youth have attempted suicide. So there's a huge disparity here, and one that needs to be addressed. The additional thing that I think is more complicated to address in graduate school training than it is in postgraduate work is the intense anxiety and fear that clinicians have when a client becomes suicidal or expresses suicidal thought. So we need to work really hard to reduce the stigma of disclosing suicidal thoughts and feelings, but also we need to work really, really hard to teach clinicians that it's not the right thing to do to refer those suicidal clients out, and that they can be the primary source of support for those people, and that they need to stop fearing liability so much and start caring and accepting those clients for who they are and what they're going through, and helping them through them at that point. So I strongly encourage you to support this measure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments.
Good afternoon. Is this on?
Yes.
We're good? Okay, great. My name is Stan Collins. I work on a variety of county and state efforts throughout California on suicide prevention. I've been working in the field actually for 15 years, and I got involved after losing a friend to suicide in high school. I'm actually here just to say thank you. Thank you for bringing this conversation to light. I think one thing that we need to remember, and through my efforts, I work with medical professionals, law enforcement, first responders, school staff, community members. Every individual has a role to play, and everyone is a spoke in the wheel. And so I think it's important to remember that the National Strategy for Suicide Prevention was first published in 2001. And I bring this up because only for 15 years have we been having national conversations about suicide prevention. Prior to that, there were pockets. And I think that more than ever, there are efforts, there is funding, there are conversations being had around suicide prevention. And I think that, again, this is not about pointing blame or passing blame or pointing fingers. I think this is simply about accountability and realizing that it's time that we have these conversations. So more than anything, I just want to say thank you. I also just want to note that I also spent 5 years working as an EMT and a lifeguard with the San Diego Fire Rescue Department, and I counted on my licensing board to require me to have the skills to make me efficient at my job. And I think this is a very similar conversation around here, but it wasn't just about my skills, it was also about the skills of my peers, trusting that those to my left and to my right were equally efficient in the skills that I have. So with that, I just want to say thank you for this consideration of this bill, and thank you for finally having this conversation. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for your comments. Oops, thank you for your comments.
Hello, good afternoon, board members and council and board staff. I want to thank you for allowing us to have this open comment section. My name is Patricia Spielman. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm here to represent Dee Dee Hirsch Mental Health Services and the Dee Dee Hirsch Suicide Prevention Center. I'm currently the division director of the Suicide Prevention Center, and in that capacity, I'm representing all of those clients and patients who have survived a suicide attempt or lost someone to suicide. And I'm also speaking as a licensed MFT who got basically no training in suicide risk assessment and prevention during my coursework and following years in practice, and also as a person who was a very young child lost a beloved grandfather to suicide. So I'm happy to hear that this is for discussion and that you are moving forward on trying to figure out the language that you want to propose for this much-needed suicide risk assessment and intervention coursework requirement. And I encourage you to continue to move forward with that, because most significantly is that the training saves lives. There are a couple of reasons that I want to discuss, and one is the need. We need to make suicide risk assessment and intervention a priority because we're not doing enough to identify and treat those who are suicidal. Suicide, as you know, and I'm going to be a bit redundant here, but bear with me, is the 10th leading cause of death in the U.S. It's twice as high as death by homicide in the U.S. and almost twice as high as drug-induced deaths that are the 19th leading cause of death in the United States. It's the second leading cause of death for teens and young adults in the U.S., and the figures for California follow these national trends. 1/3 of people, and here's where I'm going to disagree with a couple of you, 1/3 of people who die from suicide have had previous contact with mental health services within 1 year of their death, and 20% have had mental health contact within the last month of their life. So it is possible for every 10 clients we see that 2 may die by suicide. Psychologists currently must have a coursework and training in spousal or partner abuse assessment and detection and treatment of alcohol or other chemical substances. And neither of these issues has as high a death rate as suicide, but are a focus of training and competency for psychologists. I'm advocating for the professionals because it will aid in consistent training for all psychologists. Currently, 76% of graduate program directors want to include more specific suicide training. It will aid their competency and their confidence. They won't feel that they're working outside of their scope. They won't feel the need to refer to other professionals. It will aid in due diligence and duty, because legally, if someone dies by suicide, you're at more risk as a professional if you did not perform an assessment or performed an assessment woefully inadequately than if you did provide a thorough assessment and they did die by suicide. Also, it will aid in increased awareness of a national health concern. It will increase links to resources. And for clients, it will help with very limited resources for those seeking therapy after a loss to suicide, and these clients are at higher risk for suicide themselves. And it will also provide help with extremely limited resources for those seeking therapy after an attempt or those with chronic suicidal ideation. And there is definitely a need for these people. I've done both SAS, Survivor After Suicide groups, and Survivor of Suicide Attempt groups. And within both of those groups, people will always comment that they don't have anybody else to go and see. They can't find therapists, they can't find psychologists, they can't find anyone out there in the mental health community who works specifically with this topic. So California is a very proactive, forward-thinking state, often taking the initiative regarding mental health and social concerns. Let's not fall behind other states. There are already 10 other states who do have this as a requirement. Let's become a state that is nationally recognized as a leader in suicide risk assessment and suicide prevention. Thank you.
Go ahead. Excuse me. I'm sorry, I didn't get your name.
Patricia Spielman.
Ms. Spielman, there's a question from one of the board members.
Yes, Ms. Spielman. You, I don't know whether you gave a statistic for this or not, but somewhere you said about graduates want to and I didn't finish getting the
Yes,
rest of that.
76% of graduate program directors want to include more suicide-specific coursework. And that's actually from a task force from the American Association of Suicidology. It was a report addressing serious gaps in U.S. mental health training.
Okay.
It's from a journal, Suicide and Life-Threatening Behavior, which is the journal of the American Association for Suicidology.
So, okay, thank
Okay?
you.
You're welcome.
Ms. Spillman, if I may, if you could possibly, I have a business card, if you could send me a link to that, and then I can share it with the board members and staff, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
76%.
Is there any other public comment?
Yeah, if they have the money.
I'm Dr. Jo Linda Crow. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the California Psychological Association. I want to start my comments by acknowledging, as I think we all do, that suicide is a crisis in our country, with our veterans, with our teenagers, and I want to make it clear that the California Psychological Association certainly recognizes that. In fact, in my own family within the last year, we lost a 14-year-old adolescent to suicide. So I appreciate, and I think we all do, the nature of this challenge that we have in our country. But I do want to raise some things with the board about whether or not this is the answer. And I know that this has been a long and ongoing discussion. You know, the governor in his veto, with the original bill that was proposed a couple of years ago, both the California Psychological Association and the Board of Psychology opposed that bill. In the governor's veto message, the governor did not actually say that he wanted legislation on this matter. In fact, the governor said exactly the opposite. He said, rather than legislate this matter, I am sending this back to the licensing boards to discuss what to do and what the best solution would be. What this board did was to do surveys of training programs in psychology. And while I appreciate that Ms. Spielman says as an MFT she received no training, that is not true in psychology. And in your own surveys, in your report here, in your analysis of this item, a very high percentage, in fact, of training programs did say that suicide risk assessment and intervention is included in their programs. So the evidence you have from the surveys that you did indicates that for psychologists do receive training. Now, I stipulate that in any area, one could always say that you can always know more. And we have found that in any case, we have, there has been proposed mandated continuing education in dealing with the LGBT community, with diversity. Certainly, our organization has 8 specialty divisions, and I think any member of any one of those divisions would say that their colleagues don't know as much as they do about neuropsychology or industrial organization psychology. So there's always room for learning more. So I have a colleague who is a suicidologist. She is a psychologist. Of course, she's an expert in this. Not everyone is an expert, but to imply that psychologists are not well trained, I think is a misnomer. And I wanted just to say that. Dr. Phillips mentioned talking to a group in a class, and I think what you heard was that for the most part, they felt that they had received training in this area. There will always be variability because there is variability among training programs. So we have to acknowledge that, but I'm not sure that one course is going to correct what is really variability in training programs. The other thing I wanted to mention is that it seems to me that there we go. It seems to me.
I'm sorry, that's an emergency alarm. We're going to,
guess so.
I hate to interrupt your testimony, Dr.
Okay.
Lindegren. Please clear the room. So after that excitement, we are back on the record, and I return to Ms. Jones.
Dr. Jolinda Crow, continue. Sorry that we had to stop you.
Thank you. I'll see if I can collect my thoughts. Let me continue with the next train of thinking, and that is, again, the concern that certainly my organization had with the previous bill, and that is that it targets only psychologists, and some of the public has, public members have commented in their comments about this. I admire this board for taking this on. I am distressed a bit that out of all of the mental health professions and physicians, that psychologists are the ones that would be required to do additional training when we know that psychologists have the most training and most likely have more trainings than even physicians have. There are many statistics around suicide, and we have those available, and I heard you ask for the AAS report, which we certainly have access to. Some of those statistics relate to the fact that a very high percentage of people who do commit suicide have seen their primary care physician in the past few months prior to their death. So if this bill comes as a piece of legislation, certainly that will be one of the things that we will raise. Again, we don't have a position on this, on anything, because there is no bill yet. So that is, I think that is a concern. Another thing to consider is that within the field of psychology, psychologists engage in such a broad variety of work. And some psychologists do not see, they don't do psychotherapy. They do other kinds of work. For example, industrial organizational psychologists engage in consultation with organizations and with chief executives, and a lot of psychologists do various kinds of work. So this is a one-size-fits-all, which I know is the easiest thing to do, but it would be a requirement that every psychologist would take this one-time requirement. So there are concerns on that level as well. Now, just moving from those kind of broad observations to what we have before us, it does raise a little flag for me, and I just wanted to mention it, that this is, in fact, as I understood the comments, already being discussed with the legislator who has agreed to once again bring this forward. And it seems that that has taken place without board approval. So I raised that as a process question. It sounds like it's pretty far along. I share, and I want to confirm that what I heard was that the Board of Psychology would be the sponsor of this legislation. Is that, did I understand that correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. I think there is a concern with the consistency of language, just sort of moving beyond the process to what we see here. it says coursework, and then it describes experiential work, and I think there would be, if this language was actually what we were looking at in a piece of legislation, there would be a lot of work that would be needed on this language. So I know that in one
Dr.
way.
Linda Crow, and I think that that's the motion to say to continue working with the office to tighten it, to make the language into a legislative proposal. But
Okay.
it would be, that's kind of what I understood
Yes,
the language to be.
I understand. So I think I would agree that number one is, I think, rife with potential confusion. And I want to also bring everyone's attention to Section B, which we've spent a lot of time today talking about Section A. But Section B, and I want to be sure that I'm understanding this correctly, this looks to me like it would be a one-time requirement for every licensed psychologist. Is that correct? Okay. So then I think some of you mentioned that you did not want to, you didn't want to make it a requirement, but this would be exactly that, a requirement. And some of you said you didn't want to make it burdensome and
Actually, let me state what I said. I said
Yes.
that was the conversation before,
I
and
know.
after the committee took it back, we realized that we were moving forward with this for the board to review after doing it. But you're right.
Right,
in
and I'm
terms of
just
the
making a
history.
comment that it is going to be a requirement, so that we're all talking about the same thing here.
Could I ask for
The
just
Part
a-
A is for students who are graduating and might be able to document to the board's satisfaction that they have received this training in their program. Part B would be for any licensed psychologist to require a one-time.
Yes, similar to the spousal abuse and the other ones that were there
Except
one-time
those are
requirements.
pre-licensure courses.
And if you had been licensed by the time that was done, you had to do the one-time requirement.
Right.
So that's the
I'm
same
just-
kind of
right.
format.
Can I ask for a little?
Sure.
I
Sure.
thought that you could make the requirement in one of the three ways, A, B, or C.
That's under A, under 1, 2, and 3. But
So two
then
is not
then there is Section B. So Section A is.
Excuse me.
For an applicant for licensure after training.
Pardon me.
An applicant for licensure. And
I-
Section B, as I read it, refers to already licensed psychologists.
But, Dr. Linda Crow, let me just say this. If that first sentence in B says complied with subsection A, so it doesn't have to be by a one-time course. If you are a licensee but have obtained training and
Right.
in any of these other ways,
Right.
you can count that.
I thank you for that clarification. My comment on that would be that it would most likely be quite difficult for already licensed psychologists who have been in practice for a while to go back and get certification from their training director or registrar that they had had that training. So I just pointed out, I just want to be clear that we're understanding. I also wanted to go back just for a second, just briefly. Earlier, when the board first considered this issue after the governor's veto, Dr. Andrew Harlem, who was on the board at the time, raised during one board meeting the question about, I think he put it this way, and I don't want to misquote him, but if the board were going to move to make this a requirement, then at the same time, the board might want to look at the other requirements to make sure, to see if any of those courses could be eliminated. In other words, to not add on one more, but to look at it in context of all of the requirements that a psychologist has. And I'm wondering if the board is, in fact, looking at this in the total context, or if this is just an add-on of one more content area that a psychologist would need to complete?
So let me say this, because what you're saying is there's been a lot of conversations
Yes,
in the
there
last couple of years, and I think that, I see Dr. Horne's probably wanting to say something too, that we took all of these conversations into consideration at the licensing committee. So in terms of, was there a specific answer to that question? I don't know, but I think we did come to this conclusion, and I do think that several board members said different things over time, and then we voted on different things also. So it is kind of a muddled path we are here at this point in time. But that I think that, and I appreciate you bringing up that clarification about the second part of that first sentence, because we definitely said, and then we talked about the way you would prove it too. So if you were to find it, you would be certifying under penalty of perjury as you do for all of your other CPD kind of requirements.
Right.
So I think that it's all of those things, and yes, and here we are, because I think we did try to take that all into consideration. I think it is a challenge because we've had changes in board members, changes in conversations and different settings, but we did say that we kind of looked under the rubric of these one-time events, one-time requirements, if you have not completed it pre-licensure, but we also said that they did have that extra step to be able to qualify. And I would say that we came to the conclusion, as we make this motion or brought it to the board in this way, that we thought it was that important as those other things. So in fact, it would be an add-on like the other things in the past over time that have been added on. Right. And I do want to state, you're right, because we've had different conversations in different versions of the board and committees about it, but that's where we kind of are at this point. But we've taken all that, or tried to at least, I would say as committee members, try to recollect the different conversations, and like this the chronological record here also kind of helped us remember what we said and what we didn't say. But it is a little different than when it was first presented in 2015 or was at the end of 2014.
Right, I
when it first
understand.
came to the board.
So I would just close by,
give Dr. Horne a chance if
Oh,
she
of
wanted
course.
to say anything in response to that, because I couldn't tell if you wanted to say anything.
No, I agree with you. I'll just say this one piece. As we're going through the pathways to licensure, I mean, part of this is we're still going through the pathways to licensure. We're also still going through CPD requirements, stuff like that. So this isn't necessarily the kind of look that you're talking about, that hasn't necessarily been completed, but this is...
I understand.
Okay.
Thanks for that clarification. So I'll just finish by saying we'll bring it back around to where I started, and that is that the governor in his veto message referred to the fact that we have things in place to make sure that people in the healing arts are qualified to do their work. And he did not ask for legislation on this. If the board moves forward with working with an author to sponsor a piece of legislation on this topic, I would really urge you to consider broadening this out and making this a real solution then that would include not only other mental health professionals who receive far less training than psychologists do, and even broadening it out further than that to potentially include physicians. I realize what I'm saying when I say that, because I realize how difficult that is. I just feel like this is a solution that is being offered by requiring the one group of mental health professionals who probably are the best trained in this area, and leaving behind all of the others that really might get us to a better place when it comes to suicide risk assessment and intervention. We as a professional organization are always looking at this. We have courses at our convention. We have other continuing education courses. Right now we have an online course being offered through our organization that was presented at our convention 2 years ago by someone who does training with the American Association of Suicidology. This is not something that is ignored. I just think sometimes that we use sort of the wrong solution for the problem at hand. So I would really encourage the board to think about how this, what the rationale really is, complete rationale for doing this. In light of your surveys and in light of what you found out about training programs in psychology.
Thank you, Dr. Linda Crow.
Thank you.
Is there any other public comment? Hearing none, is there any other board conversation? And I just feel like I do want to respond because I think that what the veto message actually said was I would like to ask licensing boards to evaluate the issues which this bill raises and take whatever actions are needed. There was not a requirement, as you said, to take action. However, we wanted to take it seriously and look at the issue. And I do just want to acknowledge that this has been an interesting path since actually 2014. So February of 2014, we've been looking at this issue. The veto was made in August of 2014. So we've been looking at this for 2 years, and it has been a lot of different conversations. I appreciate your comments, Dr. Linda Crow, Mr. Hernandez, Ms. Spielman, and all the other folks that commented today. Is there any other board comment, or are we ready to call the vote?
I'm just going to make a brief comment, and that is that I think what the governor charged us to do was to look at ourselves and look at our licensees, to look at our registrants, and make a determination as to what we thought would be the best way to approach this if action was necessary. And I don't disagree that psychologists are in many ways some of the best trained professionals. I think psychiatrists are also actually very well trained in this particular area. Primary care physicians are not. But all that being said, I think we're trying to be responsive to the governor's veto message within the area within which we are concerned and which we regulate. I think it is incumbent on other boards to consider whether they would like to join this legislation or propose other legislation. It would depend on what their entitlement to regulate is in their particular area. So I think the reason we're looking at this as legislation is because in order for us to make this requirement, current legislation would not allow us to do that without going back to the legislature.
I think.
And then Dr. Erickson.
Okay, so I just have a question, and this is smaller in terms of responding to the comments that were made about coursework and stuff like that. What happens at this point? Like, do we have any other language we want to talk about, or how do we take those comments into consideration, about when we're talking about applied experience, what I'm
It's my thought, and I think maybe Ms. Sork might have a better idea. I mean, the motion is to move forward with a discussion on the issue as it's, and I think you're right. We've gotten probably three areas of, what section would that be? The 1B, A1, A2, A1, A2, and possibly the way we talk about B in terms of how we certify. So I think that it's moving forward, but I don't think that the language is final for the bill because there is no bill at this point. And that was what the motion is, for staff to continue working with the author to develop that. And then it would still come back to us because we're not even agreeing to a bill at this
Right.
point.
Okay.
We're giving staff the authority to continue a conversation that if it becomes a bill, it would come back to us.
Great, thank you.
Am I correct in that?
And just to make sure that I'm capturing kind of the concern, I think maybe if the board was going to, we have a motion on the table to move forward with the proposal, staff can bring some amended language to address maybe some of the concerns brought today to the board in February for consideration if we have a little bit more time. I know the experience language was brought up. I had a note that Ms. Marks had education instead of coursework for, the header on this. And while statute isn't binding on the titles, I think it might send a message capturing more what we want to cover. This isn't just coursework, it's also experience and training. So I would just suggest that if the board is comfortable enough to begin the process, then the motion would be that we would bring the language back for additional discussion in February. And then bill introduction, as I mentioned, isn't until the end of February. And our next board meeting is a teleconference in April, and that's typically when the policy committees meet. So there's still additional time that we can work on the language and communicate with the author's office on any tweaking to the language.
I'd like to ask a clarifying question. I was not part of the committee that formulated this. I'm the one that made the motion. I'm strongly in favor of us moving to get some requirement in place. Hearing public comment has raised in my mind the question of, and I'd like to have, if I could, just a little feedback as to why this is not the better proposal. Why would we not consider 6 hours of training in suicide assessment and intervention somewhere before you get your license or the first time you are relicensed? It would be simpler in terms of everyone knowing what they needed to do. It would be a requirement, one additional, for those one-time requirements, and yet I'm thinking if I had to look at each of those requirements, I'd probably pick this one if I could only pick one that I would think is important for our profession. So I'm wondering, maybe there's a way to respond to my question. I'm hoping that what we have here is a better balance of all of the issues that we need to consider.
And I'm just speaking from my own understanding of this and from the discussions we have had in the licensing committee, some of which I've been present for, some of which I haven't been present for, and that is that I think this gives more flexibility actually to licensees to be able to comply with this section. I could actually, since I've taken a suicidality course in graduate school, go to the registrar of my graduate school and just get a copy of my transcript. Or I could go to one of the internship sites I was at. I know that might be more difficult for psychologists to practice longer, but I've been practicing for a while and I still could comply with it without taking a 6-hour course. So I feel like this gives flexibility to licensees to find different ways to do it and to be able to certify under penalty of perjury that they have complied with the section, knowing that they would have to provide some kind of proof of that at a later point in time, possibly, if they were audited.
May I just wanted to say before that Dr. Joe Linder Crow, all of to all of the public members who spoke, I was really focusing in on this broadening out the legislation. And Noreen, how could we do that, or what would that look like? I'm not expecting an answer right now, but I'm just thinking that broadening out the legislation to include other healthcare professionals, I think, would be valuable in terms of doing that. And I don't know, could it be a suggestion or what it might look like? So.
I think then you're talking about a requirement that would be found more in the general provisions of the B&P unless there are very similar provisions in the psychology licensing law as well as in the Practice Act for BBS or the Medical Practice Act. But those would be beyond my expertise with respect to what the legislative process would be. I don't know if there is a model for having some kind of joint meeting with the licensing boards, but I don't know if that's really more than this board wants to tackle.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to saying that. Could it be suggested, and I'm not, once again, I'm not asking for a response right this minute, but I'm just wondering, could it be suggested, could it be noted, could it be made aware that this board is aware of other, of this kind of training, other professionals might look at it, take it into consideration, whatever that needs to be done to put it on their radar?
My response to that would be that I know that the Board of Psychology staff members have been a part of several meetings as a follow-up to that, and so I don't know if it's in our purview to recommend what another board should be doing necessarily. However, I know that staff, Mr. Burke, and his assessors have been a part of the joint group, and in terms of that research in those documents, I think that came up in ours too, that the primary physician is an important component in that. And so I think it's noted, and I think that our staff has been doing it, but I think that that could be a part of, we can put that as I would imagine if we did vote this motion up, that all the feedback that we've gotten today would be a part of a discussion we would have with the author and with staff.
And I honestly think to address what you're talking about could be the insertion of intent language in this bill to say that as leaders in our professions, we believe this is an important issue, that it also touches on other healing arts professionals, that we encourage those boards to seek similar actions or some sort of language saying that we understand that our licensees are pretty well trained, but we're making sure there's a baseline because it is such an important issue, but that we encourage the other boards to tackle this issue without kind of stepping on those other boards and making them do something. But that would be an intent language in a bill. It may not be in your statute, but whenever we're looking at the bill and we look historically, that tells us what our thinking was about the bill and what our intent was. So that's something that we could also look into, and we could start working on language for that.
I think that's a great way to do it and flag the issue and certainly hopefully bring other boards' attention back to it. But I do think that the governor's veto message was each of these boards or each of the healthcare boards should look at this issue, make a determination if training is needed within that profession, and look at a specific tool for that profession to deal with it, if that's the choice, or not do anything at all if they felt there didn't need to be any action. So I think this is more consistent. And I think to broaden the bill back out leaves us with the same question, which is I think the governor vetoes it because it's being suggested for all professions as opposed to a specific profession whose board has looked at the question. So I think this is probably the way to approach it, but I certainly think that the legislative intent language would be a great way of expressing to other boards that we think that this is something they should be taking seriously if they haven't done so already. I have no idea what other boards are doing.
It always takes one leader to move it forward, and then other people began to think about it. And thank you, Ms. Burns. That was good. The intent. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Quaybadu. Is there any other board comments, concerns, questions? Are we ready to review that motion? Okay. Seeing just stares, I'm assuming yes.
Yes.
So,
We're
Ms.
voting.
Burns, can you please call the roll?
Quaybadu?
Wait, 1 second. Do we need to repeat the motion in any way?
Oh, I can repeat it for you.
Thank you.
So the motion is to move forward with this proposal with Assembly Member Levine's office. Good.
Oh, you called?
No. I was repeating the motion.
Okay.
Okay. Do you want to?
Everyone's okay with that, Dr. Erickson?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Here we go. Quaybadu?
Yes.
Erickson?
Yes.
Bernal?
Yes.
Horne?
Yes.
Jones?
Aye.
Phillips?
Aye.
And that passes.
I know we need to break for lunch momentarily. I'm going to try to do two things. I'm going to see how far I can go before we have to stop for timing. On C2, the enforcement proposal, we are not going to do anything with this at this point in time. It has been referred to the Outreach and Education Committee, excuse me, so there will be nothing done on number 2. I'm sorry, Enforcement Committee, not Outreach and Education. Of course, it's the enforcement proposal. So it would go to enforcement. C1. Ms. Sork, do you think I have time to do this one, or should we? Okay. C1 is the omnibus proposal. This is language to clean up. Well, I'll ask Ms. Burns to say it. She'll say it better than me. and quicker, probably.
Not a problem. So this proposal is to add this provision to the omnibus. Every year, the Senate Business Professions and Economic Development Committee is going to offer up small, usually non-substantive or non-controversial changes to law, and they put it in one big, long bill called an omnibus, and it'll have lots of provisions within that bill. So this is to clean up our language. In SB 1193, our sunset bill, we made it so that psychological assistants can register themselves, and we just so happen to not change who pays the fee. So we unintentionally created a slightly disjointed system where the psychological assistant can submit their own application for registration but not pay their own fee. So this simply allows them to submit their own fee and puts it in statute. So that way we're completely covered and there won't be any issues. So this is something that, upon approval, we would, when Senate Business Professions and Economic Development asked, do we have any provisions we'd like included in the omnibus bill, we would provide them with our provision.
Thank you, Ms. Yes, pretty straightforward. Thank you, Ms. Burns. No, you're correct. Is there any board conversation about this proposal?
Does this require a motion?
It does require a motion to accept it so that we can, it becomes board-sponsored legislation, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
We would submit it to the Senate Business and Professions and Economic Development Committee, and then it would proceed along the process. Technically, it's not a board-sponsored
Right.
bill because it's an omnibus
That's right.
bill.
But we are submitting it for consideration as a part of that legislation. Any questions? So is there a motion to either support this or to not move forward with this?
I move to support the proposal to suggest this language for purposes of the omnibus bill.
I second that.
Is there any other board discussion about this proposal? Is there any public comment? Please come forward, Dr. Schaefer.
Dr. Schaefer, CPA Division 2. Just a question. So will the training sites at which psych assistants would be placed, they would still then, I would assume, submit one description of their training program for the board to review and approve? And they would not be submitting anything on a regular basis? Each time they take on a psych assistant, they would submit additional information outside of the supervisory agreement form, those forms?
If I can ask Ms. Johnson and Ms. Chung to come up to answer the question about how this process would look, that would be great. Thank you, Ms. Johnson.
Okay, well, is this on? Okay. One thing we're no longer going to be requiring is that pre-approval of the plans prior to the commencement of the experience. They'll still need to sign it. So every time a psych assistant would take on a new employment, they would still need to complete that supervision agreement form and plan. They'll hold on to that until they're ready to submit that for verification of their hours with that supervisor. But no longer are we going to have that requirement of the pre-approval. So that's another change that will take effect January 1st.
Okay. And with speaking of my KPIC hat, so psych assistants that are applying to have a postdoctoral training through a KPIC postdoctoral training site, they would follow the same suit and just put down that's a KPIC postdoc, and then would the board in some way want KPIC to provide annually or any attestation that there is in fact a postdoctoral program that's been approved by us?
No, we don't require that now. That we ourselves check that to make sure that
You're checking
that we're
it
checking
on our
it.
website?
Yes.
Okay.
Great.
Right,
And then,
thanks.
Ms. Chung, if you can talk about the two forms for the application and the change of supervisor.
We amended the current psych assistant application form to be filled out by the psych assistant so that they can apply for their registration. And from now on, they will be holding one registration for all their sites. And we also think in consideration that some psych assistant might have more than one supervisor. And then we also created a form for psych assistant to add or change supervisor each time when they do it. So whenever they change supervisor, add supervisor, they will submit this form to indicate the location of services and when would their service starts.
I just want to
I have a
clarify, to the
question,
extent
too.
people are confused by this, we're moving over to a system similar to what the Board of Behavioral Science does relative to having one registration number and then being able to change out supervisors as you go, which is what all these forms would allow us to do, if I understand correctly.
Correct.
That's helpful to hear.
So, I just have a question, and I don't remember if it was about this. We had mentioned one form, verification of experience, but there's another form that we put a parentheses in. Is this one?
We'll be discussing that later with the regulatory package for review, which is implementing changes from our Sunset Extension bill for psych assistants
Right.
and the forms that will be needed for that. As far as kind of what we receive and what we'll need on the initial application and the renewal basis, I just wanted to make sure the process was clear how that change was going to be made.
So that's not part of what we're talking about right now. Okay, thank you. Just wanted to make sure.
And just so for clarity, it's just changing the way in which the payment for registration happens in this case. But this is very helpful. Thank you, staff, to explain that. And I know that we will get to that a little bit later, another item. Is there any other public comment? Thank you, Dr. Schaefer. Any more board comment? Seeing none, can you call the vote for this item, Ms. Burns?
Akwe-Badu?
Yes.
Erickson?
Aye.
Bernal?
Aye.
Horne?
Aye.
Jones?
Aye.
Phillips?
Aye.
And that passes.
We're actually going to now, we were hoping to get through legislation before lunch, but given all the changes in the agenda, it's not possible. So we're going to come back. Ms. Jones is going to have to leave us, so Ms. Sorek and Ms. Burns and I will have to muddle our way through the rest of the report. I'm sure we won't do it with the usual panache that Ms. Jones does, but we will attempt to soldier on in her absence. And so we will see you back here at 2:15. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we are back in session. We're going to return to item number 14. As we indicated right before, we took the lunch break. Ms. Jones had to leave us for a conflicting engagement. So we're going to complete the licensing committee report with the help of Ms. Sorek. And I'm the titular one that's giving the report, but I probably won't say too much. Legislation, I'm sorry. You're right.
And I will defer to Ms. Burns. Thank you.
It's called pass the buck.
Well, and the buck stops here.
Yeah.
All right. So the 2016 legislative session has concluded. It concluded on August 31st, 2016, and the governor had till September 30th to sign or veto bills. Enclosed is the matrix that we have. It's a reminder that this is the second year in a legislative session. All bills are now dead. It's official. They're all done. Anything that is going to happen next year has to be reintroduced as a brand-new bill in the first year of the session. That also, just as a reminder, does give us those longer deadlines in the first year, where they have the month of January to submit things to Legislative Council to draft legislation, and then until the end of February, usually, to introduce the bill on the floor. So that is the first item, and we will move along if you don't have any questions on that. Seeing and hearing none. We'll next go to item 14A1A. That's AB 796, Healthcare Coverage on Autism and Pervasive Disorders. This bill repealed the sunset provision and extends indefinitely the requirement for healthcare service plans to provide healthcare coverage for behavioral health treatment for pervasive developmental disorders or autism. The bill took a opposed position on this bill. We also sent a veto letter to the governor in hopes that he would veto. He did not. The governor signed the bill on September 23rd, 2016. The opposition by the board was due to the removal of the sunset date without adequate regulation and minimum standards and services or regular review of the adequacy of the regulatory scheme in place for consumer protection. So our consumer protection issues were not taken into account. This does forestall much momentum on this front, but we can definitely talk about it at our legislative visits in February to again express our concerns for consumer protection with these providers, and we can definitely advocate for that in February. Are there any questions on AB 796?
I actually have a question. I'm sorry, did you say that we are going to start again for 2017? We start from scratch?
The legislature starts from scratch, yes, in 2017. So our hopes in advocating for continued momentum on a regulatory scheme for these providers and also for consumer protections could be included in that. In case any legislators are interested in the topic, want to continue pursuing it, or even if they have a spot bill that they haven't quite figured out what they want to do with, that we might be able to recommend different areas for them to look at. So,
And then, but from here until February, do we, have conversations on, or does the department have ongoing dialogue with them?
You can. That's why we did our legislative proposals for our items. We will get questions, I'm sure, throughout this time between December and January from legislative offices that are interested in bills, and we would answer any technical assistance questions for them, obviously looping the board in before making any action like our ledge proposals.
Thank you.
And this area is a particularly area of concern in terms of these autism providers, because now they are not certified, they're not registered, they're not licensed, they've had no background check, they're working with one of the most vulnerable populations possible, and they receive insurance reimbursement from the state for the services they provide without the benefit of any real regulatory scheme in effect. So it's very concerning to me, and I think concerning to several of the board members, that basically those consumers are going completely unprotected under the guise of providing access to care, but without any meaningful consumer protection.
Any other comments or questions? Okay. Next, we'll move on to item 14A1B, which is SB 1193, and that was our sunset extension bill. This one includes statutes relating to psychological assistance, psychologist academic requirements, continuing education, establishes policies for posting licensee information on the board's website, and extends the board's sunset, and also authorizes the issuance of retiree licenses, and makes other small technical amendments. Staff has developed an implementation plan for all of these provisions. We've looked at each section by section of the bill that applies to us, of course. And we've taken a look at, do each section need regulations? Do they need breeze changes for our systems? Do we need to send out advisories to our licensees? Policies and procedures that need change, videos, tutorials, all of those items. And we are slowly working through all of those items in order to get those implemented when they need to be. Some of the ones that require regulations would obviously be upon promulgation of regulations. And so once those regulations are adopted, we would have also those supplementary items to roll out, including the videos and tutorials and so on. So are there any questions on 1193? Okay. I will move on.
I actually have a question because I'm just looking at the psychology licensing law and I can't remember where this is, but rendering, it's the first page of the text. And it says the psychology licensing law defines the practice of psychology as rendering or offering to render for a fee psychological services. So I remember that we took that up. Is that part of our pathways to licensure? Or? Where is that?
No, in fact, that, I think that might be a misprint or older version of our language, because that was actually removed back in 2015.
Okay.
Through a Levine bill that was authored to make that change to the fee language. So that is no longer in the language, so this might just be a misprint.
Okay. We should, because this is, State of California authenticated, blah, blah, blah.
And that was in section 1, you said?
Yeah, page 92, very first page.
You know what, it might have been effective, the language, January 1.
Only until January 1, okay, 2017.
And when you're
But
looking
no,
at...
that doesn't make
No,
sense.
uh-uh.
Let's check on that,
Yeah.
Ms. Burns.
And this is in the council's digest, though. And so we can definitely look into it and make sure statute is correct. However, there are occasions legislative council's digest is somewhat inaccurate or referencing older statute. So we can definitely look into that. But we would more want to make sure that our statutory language is correct. Because that introductory text is from Leg Council. It's a digest or a summary of the bill.
Right. It's not the actual statutory language. It's a summary of our Practice Act.
So the summary could be incorrect, but the
The
legislative
summary,
text is correct.
Just make sure, because
we will
this
make
looks
sure.
like what we have otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, we're I believe it's only the first 12 sections, so, and then there's other boards that are also in there. Continuing on. Agenda item 14A2A. I want to first apologize, there are some mistakes in here. It was on the older text, so this bill would have established a College Mental Health Services Trust account upon appropriation by funds by the legislature. The last few amendments made to this bill took out the amount and where it came from. And the bill would have continuously appropriated those funds to the Mental Health Services Oversight and Accountability Commission, not Department of Healthcare Services. The rest of it is that we took a support position on this bill, but Governor Brown vetoed the bill because he felt it was premature and that it committed to a particular program structure without specifying the amount or source of funding. And without this pertinent information, he could not give the matter full consideration. So this measure was vetoed by the governor. We have called the author's office, and they're still undecided about running with this similar issue next year. They'll be taking that up in their January staff meeting, and they will be looking at how best to approach it next year. Are there any questions on that bill? All right. Item 14A2B is AB 2086. This was on workers' compensation and the inclusion of neuropsychologists. It would have authorized licensed clinical psychologists meeting specified requirements to be appointed as a qualified medical evaluator in neuropsychology. The board took a support if amended position initially, seeking clarifying language changes, and then in the August board meeting went to a full support and sent a letter to the governor urging his signature. Governor Brown vetoed this bill as he had its predecessor. The governor's veto message is on the page behind there. However, the biggest part is that he is saying that the bill would relate to legal evaluations, not medical treatment of injured workers as suggested by the declaratory text of the measure. If enacted, the bill would create a unique lower standard for a select group of providers with a direct financial interest in being appointed as qualified medical examiners in California's workers' compensation system. We called the office of the author, and they're still unsure as well about going with this. I'm going to be giving you that update on a lot of the bills, but just so you know, most of their staff are going to be meeting December, January to figure out what they're doing within the next year, what issues they're going to continue to pursue, which of those are going to drop off, which that they might advocate that other members take up. So I just want to make sure we're letting you know, we're checking in, and most of them are pretty unsure whether they're going there next year.
On this bill in particular, Ms. Burns, do you get the impression that that people are confused by the veto message?
No, I get more the concern that they're not going to continue pursuing it. It's failed twice
Well,
now.
I think, ultimately that is the issue, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure somehow that the governor, and I, with the greatest respect to him, he just reappointed me to the board, but I'm not sure that the governor understood necessarily the distinction as it related to workers' compensation. So maybe there's an educational piece there as to neuropsychologists and their roles that could better be addressed. Hopefully, there will be a sponsor going forward.
Yeah, we'll be working to find that. And then also, I think this would be a great topic for our February legislative visits as well, to talk about that role of neuropsychologists and also to advocate that someone pick up the mantle on this, even if Cooley and Assemblymember Mathis are not. So that way we can still encourage it with those members of the business and professions committees.
I know that when I heard about the veto and then read the message, I was perplexed. I couldn't quite understand what the governor was referring to. And it looks like, well, there may be lots of information the governor has that we don't that went into his statement, but what I can say is that in order to get treated for a neuropsych condition, it has to be diagnosed. And to get the diagnosis, you need to see a qualified medical evaluator, typically, in neuropsychology. So this is not just about evaluators wanting to get more business. It's about the injured worker who has a condition that needs treatment, and that treatment can happen only when the condition is diagnosed by a competent and qualified professional. I hope I'm saying that in a way that makes sense to everyone. I have strong feelings that this is an important part of workers' compensation, and I'm troubled and yet hopeful that we can find a way to get an answer, to get the neuropsych people back in to do the evaluations.
And I think even your explanation to me is even clearer now than it has been for myself. And that maybe some of that and the caveats to this should be in some sort of fact sheet on this and why it's so critical. The governor is probably taking more into account his agencies that provide their position on the bill and their reasonings for opposing it and vetoing it. Understandably, he has to work with that agency and how they operate and their safeguards. But I think some educational effort on our part to explain what you just did would move this position significantly.
And when the time seems right, I'd be glad to offer among many people that might be interested to see what I can contribute to that.
That would be great. I think putting together a good fact sheet would be extremely helpful on this issue.
And I imagine CPA would join in offering help with that as well.
I'll comment in a minute when you take public comment.
If there aren't any other questions, I'll go ahead and move on to the next one. That's A3. So these are all the bills that had positions but that died along the way in the process. So they died along the committee process way. They didn't make it to the governor. 1715 was the behavioral analysis bill. That was one that the board put a lot of work into analyzing and to understanding how that would impact our board and the field. This bill was pulled from consideration and they decided not to pursue it. The board had taken a support position. The author is still unsure about pursuing it in the next session, and I think this is one issue that would be a great, again, consideration for our February meetings where we talk about this issue along with AB 796. Are there any questions on 1715? The next one is AB 2443, and that was on local control and accountability plans. This would have required a description of annual goals to be achieved for each of the state's delineated priorities for all pupils and certain subgroups of pupils, to add those factors and the number of practicing school psychologists working on school climate issues into the local control accountability plans, which each school district has to provide every year. This bill was held in the Assembly Appropriations Committee on the suspense file, which means it had a significant cost attached to it, and that the Appropriations Committee was not going to pass it out of there. This one, they are still unsure about pursuing a similar bill next year, but we will continue to follow up with them as well. Are there any questions on that? SB 1034 was the other healthcare coverage bill on autism. So this one was similar, but with different factors in it for qualified autism service professionals. This one, they're still unsure about if they're going to pursue similar legislation, not for the extension of the sunset, but on the whole applied behavior analysis and protections. But they'll be discussing it at their January meeting. So that is encouraging that they are looking to discuss this issue in January, so we should definitely follow up with Mitchell's office.
I just have a quick question as it relates to autism. Isn't this very close to the other one we just?
Yes.
Okay.
These two were very similar bills, and they traded off different positions throughout the process. So, but the fact that they're still interested in some of the things that were left out of those bills is encouraging. So we could be looking at ways to insert that consumer protection aspect back in.
Thank you.
Further questions from the board on those particular bills? I think I'd like to take public comment on that first group, which were bills where we did have positions and the outcomes. Are there any comments from the public on any of the items that appear under 14A?
Yeah.
Don't you want to? I had understood that you wanted to speak on that.
Joe Linder Crow with the California Psychological Association. Just a comment on 2086, the workers' comp bill. This was a bill that was co-sponsored by the California Psychological Association and the California Society of Industrial Medicines, CSIMS. And we do feel that the governor's veto message was a bit confusing and did not reflect really the content or the intent of the bill. We have worked extensively. Both times this bill has been put forward with the agencies, with the Department of Industrial Relations. I think it is a matter of perhaps not fully understanding the range and the nuances about the legal evaluations versus the medical evaluations. You saw that reference. I think so we are working and have been working extensively on this. Obviously, we're very disappointed with the outcome. Our Division of Neuropsychology was heavily involved in this in many, many meetings. I expect we will be reassessing. So it may be more a matter of whether our two organizations feel that this would be productive to put forward this bill again. We appreciated the board's final full support of the bill. We will be reassessing this as we move into the new year. It's a very complicated issue, and we feel like maybe the governor might not have gotten complete information about some of the aspects of it. We're concerned about that. So we will continue to work with CSAMS, and we will also continue to explore whether or not we think it, as I said, would be productive in the environment that we, as we understand it to be, to move forward or not.
Thank you, Dr. Linda Crow. Any other comments as it relates to 14A? Ms. Burns, maybe we could move on to 14B then?
$14B is all of our watch bills. So these were all bills that we took a look at and decided that we didn't want to take an active position on, such as support or oppose. AB 2859 was on professions and vocations, the retired category licenses. This was for DCA-wide to allow retired licenses, so we already had our retiree license in our sunset provision, so this just allows the rest of the DCA boards to have the retiree, classification of And the governor did sign that bill, so presumably there will be actually a bigger push throughout DCA on different issues with the Breeze system and other things that will help us along with our retiree licenses as we're all working towards that. So, are there any, I'm going to assume there's not too many questions about this and roll right through? Okay. You got it. The next item is 1835, and it's on private post-secondary education and operating standards. The bill would have added additional accreditation exemption criteria for a psychoanalytical degree granting institution. This was focused on one school in particular, and the governor vetoed this bill, stating that he was not convinced that conferring special treatment on this one subset of professionals is warranted when other means exist to comply with this state law. So that school has other means to get accreditation or to get into programs that are, so that they would be covered. So the governor did veto that. The next set of these are all watch bills that all died along the way, also in the committee process. These were, the first one, AB 2507, was on telehealth access. This one might be actually a lot more to the board's concern because it would have added video and telephone communications to the definition of telehealth. I think it would have also prohibited an insurer from interfering with the provider-patient relationship based on the telehealth services. Staff reached out to Assemblymember Gordon's office, and they expressed plans to pursue the bill again next year, I think as a policy, but said they'd want it sponsored by a different assembly member. So I don't know, that seems a little contradictory in terms to me, but I think that's we'd like to still pursue it, but we're not sure we would be the author for it. This is definitely something we're going to want to address at our February meetings, and talking about how psychologists use telehealth to provide services to their patients and continuity of care, and that the use of telephone and video is integral to that.
Quick comment on that. The telephone and video, I think, is important, but as I looked at the bill, the big part is the reimbursement, which I'm guessing maybe the insurance industry may have had, shall we say, some questions about whether they wanted that to go through. And I'm personally interested in seeing how this develops and if we can find a way to move it forward for the benefit of all.
Absolutely. I think there's definitely room for us to help be leaders in this conversation. And then, obviously, the concern for the state is the Medi-Cal costs, so the reimbursement on the Medi-Cal side. So that's definitely a big part of that. Up next is SB 1033, the Medical Board Disclosure of Probationary Status. This one died on the Senate floor. It was to develop a standardized format for listing specified information related to probation of licensees, and to provide that information to an inquiring member of the public on any documents informing the public of probationary orders on specified profile, internet page for each licensee. Staff reached out to Senator Hill's office and the Senate Business and Professions Committee. Both are unsure and stated that they'll be discussing it at their upcoming meetings. So, again, a lot of offices are in the wind-down process. They're also going to start winding up in December and January and are pretty unsure about where they're going. SB 1101, the alcohol and drug counselors, regulation of those. It would have prohibited any person from using the title of licensed alcohol and drug counselor unless the person has applied for and obtained a license from the Department of Consumer Affairs. This bill died and was held in the Senate Appropriations Committee, also due to cost. And when we reached out to Wajkowski's office, they expressed no desire to pursue the bill next year on the basis that they tried before, and it does not get very far through the process. So this is in the one instance where we gotta no more, we're done with this issue. If we wanted to look at it again, it would be with a different author, obviously. SB 1155 was professions and vocations, licenses in the military. It would have required each board within the Department of Consumer Affairs to grant a fee waiver for active military, and those honorably discharged. The bill died in the Assembly Appropriations Committee, again on the suspense file, so due to costs. And Senator Morell's office said that they are going to decide whether or not they pursue it in their January meeting. SB 1194 was originally our sunset bill, and then it was amended. We were amended out of it, and it became the bill about the North Carolina Dental Board decision. And that bill was pulled by the author from consideration at the Assembly Business and Professions Committee. So I do expect that we will be dealing with this issue in the future, but this bill for now, not going anywhere. The next up is SB 1204, and it was on the health professions development, the loan repayment programs. It would have done a variety of things to increase the loan reimbursement grants. During session, Senator Hernandez stopped pursuing this bill and instead was pursuing SB 1471, which applied to physicians, surgeons, and psychiatrists. And that also died on the Assembly suspense file. So both of them have costs associated. The author went with the other bill instead of this one, and hopefully we can reinvigorate those conversations next year in February about loan repayment and increasing those opportunities for psychologists. There's nothing else to talk about on that one. SB 1217 was healing arts on reporting requirements and liability. This would have required the department to only hold, what do you call it? This one is always an odd one for me, sorry. We would only have to store judgments and settlements with damages over $10,000 instead of the current $3,000 limit. This one died in the Senate Committee on Business Professions and Economic Development, and Senator Stone's office confirmed they will not be pursuing this bill next year. SB 1334 was on reporting, and this bill would have required healthcare practitioners who provide medical services to a patient who discloses that he or she is seeking treatment due to being a victim of assaultive or abusive conduct to additionally report that to law enforcement. This bill died and was held in the Senate Committee on Appropriations due to the costs. We have no more comments on that one, and that is it for the watch bills.
Are there any board comments on the watch bills? Any public comment?
Ask a question. What did you say about assembly being?
On last one?
Could you repeat the question, Sharice? Could you repeat the question?
Oh, she asked what I said about Assembly B and P, and I'm trying to figure out which one we were on for that one. 1217 was held in Senate Business and Professions, but it wasn't Assembly. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, why don't we proceed on to item C?
We've already completed C before lunch.
Oh, we did? Oh,
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So those were the ledge proposals.
Is that what would you like to go to next?
I think you can go to item 15.
The next item is the legislative items for future meeting, and this is a placeholder on the agenda just in case there was something else that hadn't been covered. It's a placeholder for discussion items, but the staff does not have any further legislative proposals or issues to bring to the board's attention.
Thank you. Could we go to the update on CANRA?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So this is item 14E, and it's the update on the California Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act, also known as CANRA. And for this one, there's been very little movement because right now it's in the Court of Appeals, and the litigation had been sitting for a few months. They are, however, hearing oral arguments yesterday for that case, and so we probably will not have any sort of results or announcements for up to 6 months or more. So we'll be updating the board as we get information. And then, of course, trying to meet with Garcia's office again, who Assemblymember Garcia was the one who initiated the request in the first place. So,
are we able to hear about the nature of the litigation, who's brought the action, the basis for the appeal, and where it's likely to go, or do we know any of that?
I haven't had any update on all of that. I think that was in a previous board item.
Okay.
In our August
no
meeting.
No need to know any further.
Apologies. I wrote this as just the quick update for it. There was more information on it in August. But when we do a next update in February, I can make sure to make a more exhaustive brief, and that way you guys can have a little more of an update.
My recollection was it was an action brought by some individual marriage and family therapists or other licensees of BBS that was seeking a clarification of the law. And of course, we all know that we had asked for an opinion from the Attorney General's office. Oop, sorry about that. We'd requested opinion from the Attorney General's office, and that derailed the process, and we're hoping to get that back on. If the litigation doesn't answer the question, then to get that back on the agenda, because it's been dropped off the Attorney General's list of items for which they have to issue an opinion.
That's sufficient for me. I'm not needing to request any further information. Thanks.
I was going to say I can provide it if you want.
Okay, number 15, regulatory update and review.
And 15A is on the psychological assistant package. This regulatory package is being submitted to the board for review and approval. The changes to this regulatory package implement the statutory changes relating to psychological assistance that were established by the board's Sunset Bill, SB 1193. These changes were reviewed and approved by the licensing committee at their September meeting, and we are asking for a review of the draft language and the rulemaking file, or draft rulemaking file in your binder, and a move to accept the language, to notice for hearing, and to grant the executive officer discretionary authority to make any necessary changes to the regulatory package.
Dr. Horne?
So actually, as I read through this again for the licensing committee, just kind of reading through it, 1391.6 supervisor's responsibility. There are a couple things. One is everywhere here we have psychological assistant listed except for lines 72 through 76. We talk about supervisee. Line 74 and line 75 specifically. And I think we ought to change that to say psychological assistant. And then we've said that everywhere. And the other thing, because again, we are a generic license, and line 68, we talk about a client or patient's chart, and I think maybe we ought to say records, because it's not all charting.
Nice catches, Dr. Horne.
Okay, so I have one more.
Okay.
And that is the form on line 131. We don't have anything there, and it's another place we have this too. It'll be line, let me see, where was that? I thought I saw it on two places, but at least line 131.
It's also on line 7.
Was it line 7?
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Line 7.
The names aren't filled in on the hand carry. However, once we have an official name
Oh,
for the
okay.
form, we can put that in there.
Okay. Yeah, obviously, all right. Then that's fine. If we had it on the hand carry, I missed that, so, sorry.
Ms. Burns was corrected. The form, we just need the name of the form, and then we can insert that into the language.
Okay. And when does that come? I mean, how can we move forward without having the name
Right.
of the form is partly what I'm asking.
Yes, so we check with public affairs, so we have the authority to name our forms like however way we want. That was we were waiting for the answer prior to the board meeting. That's why we couldn't put the form name up there. So, but we got the confirmation, so we would name it with a number that would make sense for the board. For example, Psych Assistant, we'll probably name it with like our initial PSB form, like with a number. And then so it will be clear and make sense to us and to applicants as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, any further board comment on this regulatory package? Does somebody want to make a motion?
Accept the regulatory language in, and the bill with the exceptions made, as the exceptions are made by Dr. Horne, or with the exceptions made by Dr. Horne. Does that get at it, Sister?
So Ms. Akwebudu, that's, you're approving that language
Yes.
as amended for noticing, and you want to set it for hearing?
Exactly.
And delegating the authority to staff to proceed with the rulemaking?
Yes.
What an excellent motion you made, Ms. Akwebudu.
No, with the help of. Thank you.
And I second.
And staff would have the authority to change the hearing date to make it congenial with our board meeting?
Yes.
The staff has authority to make all technical, non-substantive changes to proceed with the rulemaking file?
Okay, is there any board discussion relative to the package? Is there any public discussion? Hearing none, I believe we can probably call the roll. Ms. Burns?
Akwebudu?
Yes.
Erickson?
Yes.
Bernal?
Yes.
Horne?
Aye.
Phillips?
Yes.
That passes.
Okay, Ms. Burns, would you address the second item under 15?
Sorry, I was clarifying first and seconds there while I was trying to write the motion.
Okay.
Sorry, what was your question?
The second item under item
Gotcha.
15?
Sorry. Juggling on the paper. Item B is on the verification of experience and supervision agreement forms. This rulemaking file was noticed for the initial 45-day comment period on April 1st, 2016. The hearing took place at the May board meeting, and the final regulatory package was completed by staff and submitted to the Department of Consumer Affairs for review on June 28th, 2016. The package was approved by agency as of October 24th, 2016, and is now being sent to the Department of Finance for review, and that is the last stop before it makes it over to the Office of Administrative Law. So until we hear further from Department of Finance and usually through DCA about when it goes to Office of Administrative Law, that's the update we have for now.
Any comments from the board? Any comments from the public? Oh, did you want to say something? I'm not sure what she said.
I'm sorry, just going back to the Psych Assistant RIPE package. At the licensing committee meeting, members has requested us to draft the forms for to bring it for the board review. So I just want to bring your attention if you have any comments or amendments to provide for us to make changes. So.
And this item can be found in 15A in your packets, and it's right behind the initial statement of reasons. The first form is the application for registration as a psych assistant or psychological assistant, and then the second form is the notification to add or change supervisor or service location for a psychological assistant.
Are there any comments or feedback on the form from the board? From the public? And perhaps if any board members have any questions or comments that are non-substantive, they can provide those to Ms. Sorick at a later point in time.
Can I ask a question? It's all the same. Section 6, acknowledgements. Please read each statement below and indicate that you understand by placing your initials in the corresponding box in blue ink. Is there a reason for that?
We have our staff who has been working on the application, because sometimes it's easier for us to, because so it's to prove that it's like a wet original signature is much easier to process than if it's a black, it could be a photocopy. Yeah.
That's a
thanks.
Good point. Thank you.
Okay, well, I think that concludes our discussion of agenda item number 15. And we will now move on to agenda item 16. Dr. Erickson?
As board members can see and the public can see, this report pertains to our latest iteration of proposed regulations for telehealth. The background material on the cover page indicates proposed additions to CCR Title 16 to address standards of practice for telehealth. Item B is Business and Professions Code, Section 2290.5, telehealth. The third item, C, is BBS telehealth regulations for reference. And finally, D is an article written by an attorney entitled Licensing Board Issues Warning to Patients Who Travel Out of State. So our goal today is review the draft language and with the intent to move to accept the language as written and proceed to a rulemaking file. Would it be helpful to any board members or the public if we had, should I refresh the background on how we got here? We've had several telehealth committee meetings. Most recently was October 16, I believe, or thereabouts, where we created the current, maybe it was October 14, where we created the current draft proposal that's in the binder. At that meeting, Dr. Siegel from ASPPB participated. Dr. Phillips and I were there, staff were there, and I believe CPA, I'm forgetting whether CPA was present that day or had given us advanced input before the meeting. Some of the issues that have come to light that we've tried to make the most balanced position on has to do with what happens when a California client, meaning someone who's receiving therapy from a licensee, happens to be out of state and needs service. We've looked at the question of should it be the place where they're located that determines the jurisdictional overview, or should it be if there are resident and they're temporarily out of state, should we have some say over providing, our licensees providing service, provided they don't interfere with the laws of the other state? We've looked at the question of whether it should be telehealth versus telepsychology, and I think the resolution of that is that the statute uses the term telehealth and at one point indicates that telemedicine is to be included within telehealth. And I think the committee recognizes there's been public input about telepsychology. We should own the profession. And I think there's a point for that as I see it, and I think the committee in general sees it, and we can discuss as needed. We're probably better to take the road of going with what's in statute and being part of the telehealth designation rather than trying to forge a separate telepsychology. So those are a couple of the issues that we've looked at that have been a little, mixed input as to what would be the best way to proceed. Perhaps if people have had a chance to look, we have two versions of the standards of practice, an unmarked and a marked version. The hope was that staff and committee would be able to work better with both versions, and also it would be more easily digested here at the board meeting. Also, by way of background, the committee composition has changed in the last couple of years. I was on the committee for a while and then off. Dr. Phillips came on and did a tremendous amount of work with Dr. Harlem for the better part of a year, and certainly a vast portion of what we have here is due to their hard work. And then I took Dr. Phillips' place when he became president, so I'm back on the committee. A long way of saying that I'm thankful to board members who have contributed to this. It's certainly due to their efforts and to staff's efforts. And I think you and I are both available, Dr. Phillips, to try to answer questions or help sort out anything that might be part of a discussion among board members and then public comment.
I'm going to presage an issue which was brought to my attention. I didn't have an opportunity to bring it to your attention, Dr. Erickson. I apologize. And by the way, Dr. Erickson has been the moving force behind this whole thing. It's an area of particular interest to him, I think.
True.
And that is that we've tried to anticipate different ways in which people would be practicing interjurisdictionally. And the question has arisen as to what happens to the person who's a non-resident of the state of California that is non-resident in the sense of being a legal permanent resident, who is leaving the state, perhaps they're attending college in California, they have a therapist here, they leave the state for Christmas vacation or a family emergency or whatever. They can't, the statute, the question was framed, does the statute provide for that type of interjurisdictional practice? And I think the answer to that question is no. So I think that's an issue that was brought to us by CPA, and perhaps Ms. Winkleman or Dr. Linda Crow, or Dr. Winkleman, excuse me, or Dr. Linda Crow could further expand on that when we get to the public comment section.
I'm sorry, I just have a question, and again, I wasn't here before, but
all questions are good.
Thank you, Dr. Erickson. So I was just wondering, though, did we get a consensus regarding, like, from the professionals, if they prefer to be under telehealth or under telepsychology? Oh, and I'm just thinking, too, that when we travel out of state, our insurance coverage goes with us, right? So it's almost like I feel that we're not crossing into any other jurisdictions. It's just, it's attached to the individual. So I'm just wondering if we talked about that within this context.
Well, I think one of the questions there is to what extent insurance companies, and I don't want to get too far into that issue, actually pay for telehealth or telepsychology, whatever you'd like to call it. So even though our insurance would travel with us if we had to go to the emergency room or see a doctor or something while we're there, or see a therapist, there's a question as to whether they'll actually pay for telehealth. I think anecdotally, a lot of psychologists have related to me that their insurance companies are very reluctant to pay for telehealth services. It's been a subject of some discussion on listservs that people are concerned about telehealth reimbursement in general and interjurisdictional telehealth as well. I think the idea behind using the term telehealth versus telepsychology was not so much about the preference within the field, because I think the preference of the field would probably be to call it telepsychology. It was to match the regulation to the enactment from the legislature that permitted us to draft the regulation so that we would minimize confusion when it went back through review. Is that a fair statement?
Is it statute or regulation? I'm not sure it matters, but.
Well, the statute enables us to pass the regulation, right? So the
Yes.
statute preceded it, and it refers to telehealth, not
So it's in
telepsychology.
statute, yes.
Yes. Yeah. Does that make sense?
And I don't know if you were referring to also malpractice coverage, which should go with us. So we have our insurance as providers, and the client or patient has maybe some insurance, hopefully as a patient. Probably our malpractice insurance goes with us unless we're doing something that is contrary to regulation, and one of the, well, maybe, I've forgotten, you know?
I had a discussion with one of the largest insurers of psychologists. I don't know that this would be true of all professional liability carriers. I have the feeling it probably would be. And that is, as long as we of the board permit the practice, then it will be covered by our professional liability insurance, which is why we've been careful in the way that we've crafted the language so that it doesn't appear that somehow we're saying it's okay, but we're not we're not being permissive in allowing you to do it. It's just,
Got it.
you're on your own as to whether you want to do it or not. Because we wanted to make sure that for purposes of licensees, that they would still have their malpractice or professional liability insurance in place, not only for the benefit of the licensee, but also for the benefit of the consumer of their services, who might somehow be injured in that context. We would want the malpractice insurance to cover it so that they would actually be paid, hopefully, for whatever judgment they might get.
Dr. Horne?
So I like this. I mean, I know y'all have done a lot of work. It's really good. So this is just a question. I don't want to throw any kink in here. But this is about telehealth. So really, it should only apply to psychologists who are trained who are essentially health service providers, not general applied psychologists, but, clinical counseling, that kind of psychologist. So I'm wondering if anywhere in here that distinction should be made. I mean,
It's a good question.
I know we have a general license, but, it would be kind of.
I believe Ms. Marks offered the opinion last time at the last board meeting that if a person is using a license, then it would pertain to them if they're using telehealth.
Yeah, but that's not exactly my question. I understand that, but I mean, this is really, and again, this is a question, but the training doesn't allow everyone who's licensed. Our training doesn't allow all of us. I mean, so we have to always work within our competence,
Sure,
our
truly.
areas of competence. That's part of what we require. But this is absolutely talking about telehealth as opposed to telepsychology, which I see as broader.
Or teleconsulting or teleorganizational.
Well, to me, that's part of telepsychology, but this is specifically telehealth. And so, I don't know, it's just a question, is that something we should say? I mean, these are, even though it's a general license, or, it's just truly
It's
a
a good
question.
question.
I don't want to.
And I just wanted to to jump in on that as this is the wave of the future of where we're going just with healthcare in general. I mean, there's good food for thought as we move forward.
So, Dr. Horne, if I understand your question correctly, is whether or not it would be a broader application if it referred to telepsychology, because it would involve all those people using their license to provide psychological services, whether they're health-based or not.
To me, that's a broader concept. But this is about telehealth,
Right.
and so I wonder if we should specify that. I mean, it won't really, shouldn't apply to all our
Right.
licensees.
I think that I think Dr. Phillips is right, is that we landed on the side of telehealth because of the statute, but I don't think we really considered that potential in that it was a limited application to psychologists who were using their license to provide healthcare services versus non-healthcare services. The statute on the one hand, refers to telehealth, means the mode of delivering healthcare services in public health via information communication technologies, et cetera. But then it talks about a healthcare provider, and a healthcare provider is a person licensed under the division, which would be any psychologist. So there's a little bit of disconnect there with respect to this particular profession. And I don't know that the committee really considered that, and that might be a reason to go back to talking about telepsychology to cover those licensees who provide psychological services, but they're not necessarily health services. But I think that's a policy call.
I think there was some back and forth on this in the committee meetings, and if you'll notice subsection B4, where it says that the licensee needs to be competent to deliver such services. So I think to the extent that what we're saying to people is you need to be competent in order to deliver these services, I think it's pretty explicit in there.
It's competent in the delivery of psychological services via telehealth. That's what they have to be competent in. That's what this is saying.
Right, which is
Yeah.
psychological services via telehealth. You have to be competent in
Right.
psychological services, and you have to be competent in the telehealth.
Okay, that's actually, but psychological services is broader than health. This is.
Right. Oh,
that's
I
part of
understand what you're
that's part of
saying.
I want to say. So I don't want to put something like this on somebody who isn't a health service psychologist. I think that would be inappropriate. I think it's unless we say something broader. And so I mean I'm just. I don't know. I didn't want to create problems. I think y'all have really done a good job, but I think we really want to think about those psychologists who are, because they are not health service providers, a lot of what general applied psychologists do is via telepsychological means versus telehealth means. Anyway, I wouldn't want to restrict those folks or get them in trouble for a statute that we have that's really about health service psychology.
So you want to be clear that the regulation doesn't necessarily limit providing psychological services in a non-health capacity, because particularly I'm thinking that
That's
maybe
right.
sub B, all of those conditions really apply when you're providing health services,
Exactly.
healthcare services.
Exactly. That's
So then the
exactly
question is whether or not you're by implication limiting those people who aren't providing health services, or whether you want to broaden it to talk about telepsychology, but then talk about people who are providing telehealth services being subject to those conditions.
And this is where I get back to the original statute. And as I read the statute, although there, as you pointed out, Ms. Marks, it is somewhat contradictory. I think they're talking about healthcare delivery.
That's what I think too. That's why I'm saying, do we
we
want to
could-
say something here that
Well,
doesn't?
we could say the provision of healthcare-related services,
We could say that
couldn't we?
here somewhere. I mean,
Just to be devil's advocate, I just
Yeah.
want to, if someone was a licensed psychologist and they were providing telehealth, they were providing telepsychology, would you not want the same criteria considered? I know this, as Dr. Erickson mentioned, we did talk about this with a different makeup of the committee. We also had a different legal counsel at the time who had given advice that telehealth is telepsychology. They're kind of synonymous. I don't want to put words into Mr. Hepler's mouth here, but it was my understanding that he was interpreting it to cover all areas of psychological service, and that was one of the reasons why we put patient or client in the language, so that it would cover both a healthcare setting and a non-healthcare setting. But that was just my remembering of the discussion.
Yeah, I agree, and we always do that, say client or patient, but really the terminology here is healthcare. I mean, all these different things. Number 2 is healthcare, number 3, we're talking diagnosis, blah, blah, blah. These are healthcare things. And I'm not saying that we wouldn't want people to, to be, to practice in the area of competence, and maybe that's enough. Then if somebody doesn't have that training, that's fine. But, I mean, this is truly about delivering health care.
So if you're not wanting to limit the provision of psychological services via sort of technological means, does it help if you refer to telepsychology, and then when you're talking about the following conditions, which are more healthcare related, say subject to the following conditions as applicable to the provision of services? So in other words, if this is not what I would do for my client as opposed to my patient, then then it's sort of a not NA kind of not applicable situation. I'm wondering if that's where you're going with it potentially? So you're not necessarily meaning to limit the provision of psychological services by technological means.
I guess I go back to we're passing the regulation pursuant to the statute.
Right.
The statute's about healthcare delivery.
That's right.
It's pretty clear to me that
So even if we
is.
just said for psychologists who are involved in health service delivery, I mean, it just kind of says, don't practice outside your area of competence, and, we're really talking about a specific kind of service delivery, not every kind of service delivery.
Well, that's my question, and I'm wondering what you think. Do we want to craft this in a way that a psychologist that does business consulting would know that they should comply with this, or do we want to craft it in a way where they understand they're not included in this? Which way are you thinking?
Well, that was my original thinking, because the way it's written, it's like this really isn't about the delivery of.
I don't think the statute is about the delivery of other types of psychological services.
I agree.
So I don't think we could pass a regulation that would incorporate that into this.
Makes good sense.
It's not to say that there shouldn't be, but it is to say that I think we'd have to have more legislative clarity as to whether that fell within our purview in terms of passing a regulation. So I'd really rather make this explicit, that it relates to the delivery of healthcare services, and then wait to see what develops relative to the
That's totally
legislative
fine with me,
scheme.
but I do want.
It's a great question you've raised.
Yeah.
It's a great question you've raised. And there was some discussion within the committee, are these standards going to be the standards that somebody would use if they were doing non-healthcare related service? But I don't think we got the clarity of thought that your question raised.
I agree.
Yeah.
And it occurs to me that if HIPAA is part of the calculus, then it's healthcare, and if HIPAA is not, then that's something else, but it could still be psychological service.
Then do you need to refer to psychological healthcare services?
Mm-hmm. Yep. To me, that would, we're not talking about a healthy organization, even though I know, like y'all do, healthy organizations, CPA does and stuff like that. But really, we are talking about something very specific here that I think is,
So was Ms. Marks suggesting on line A, about halfway down the line, that we insert healthcare in front of services?
We could do it right at the beginning, couldn't you? To provide psychological health care services.
Healthcare.
Via telehealth.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
I think I would rely on the licensees to help define that, or give me the correct phrase,
Yeah.
but that's kind of what I was suggesting, if trying to figure out which way you want to go, if you're looking at this really relating to telehealth services versus telepsychology.
We could actually still keep the patient and client language.
Right.
Most
Because a lot of
psychologists have
people
come to refer to their, what I think of as their patients as clients.
I agree that's fine even for healthcare. But yeah, just adding that one word specifies it. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about the delivery of healthcare services.
I think it's a good question with an adequate answer.
Okay, thank you.
Good question,
An easy fix.
for once.
Other board discussion on the proposed standards?